Welcome back to our little dream. I know you're tossing and turning, or maybe you're looking for something to ease you into sleep. A little story, a gentle fear to tuck you into bed. But let me warn you, these are not fairy tales. Tonight, our story begins on a lonely stretch of road in Montana, a long, winding stretch with nothing but pine trees and darkness, and a long-haul truck driver named Ethan. Ethan, he's a simple man, grew up in the country. No stock in ghosts or tall tales. He believes in what he can see, what he can touch. He believes in the road, in his rig, in strong coffee and the numbers on the odometer. For him, life is a series of journeys, and every journey has a destination. He's been on the road for 3 days, since Wyoming. He's on Route 101, or at least a small offshoot of it, a 2-lane road cutting through the middle of nowhere. The pine trees are tall and close together on either side, so close they look like bony fingers reaching out of the ground. The only light is from his headlights. The wipers keep a steady beat, a familiar rhythm, trying to hold back the soft drizzle. The clock on the dashboard reads 1:37 a.m. He's only about 20 miles from his next rest stop. He's got the timing down to the minute. Pull over, fuel up, grab another coffee, and get back on the road. But then he saw him, a figure, standing on the side of the road. No car, no sign, just a single man, standing still in the rain. He's wearing a ratty black jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He isn't waving, he isn't doing anything. He just stands there, staring straight at the truck. As it passes, Ethan felt a small knot of unease form in his chest. What was that about? What could he do? Stop? This guy didn't look like a normal hitchhiker. Maybe a breakdown? Number, he thought. Not my problem. I'm on a schedule. He passed by, and the figure disappeared from his rearview mirror. But about 10 miles later, after a long sweeping curve, he saw him again, standing in the exact same spot, on the right side of the road. Black jacket, baseball cap, standing straight, looking directly at the truck. That was impossible. Ethan had been going 60 miles an hour for the past 10 miles. There were no other cars, no other roads. That man could not be there. A cold feeling began to spread across his skin. It was something he couldn't explain. He couldn't file it away neatly in his mind. He hit the gas. The truck roared and sped up. He looked in his rearview mirror, and he saw him, standing there, getting smaller and smaller in the mist, staring. Ethan couldn't explain it. He had gone 10 miles. He had been going 60 miles an hour. No person could travel 10 miles in 10 minutes. And he had passed him already, right? He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was 2 different people. A coincidence. I mean, they looked the same. He went on for another 15 miles, and he saw it. The dim light of a gas station up ahead. A feeling of relief washed over him. Almost there. Almost out of this. But then, he saw him again, standing right in front of the gas station door, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a can of pop. He wasn't looking at the truck. He was looking right at Ethan. His eyes were empty. Ethan noticed something terrifying. This man looked exactly like him. The same face, the same haircut, the same way he stood. It was a duplicate. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't stop. He pushed the gas pedal harder. A thought flashed through his mind. This man didn't want to ride. He didn't want to hurt him. He just wanted to be here, waiting. But waiting for what? Ethan's truck roared past the gas station. He looked in his rearview mirror, and the figure was gone. He let out a sigh of relief, finally free. But then, he saw something on the dashboard, something he had never seen before. A lighter, an old brass lighter. It was his lighter, the one he had lost at home. His lighter, but it was there. And then, a voice came from the back. A low, raspy voice. You forgot this. Last we saw Ethan, he was speeding away from a gas station, a cold dread clinging to him like the fog on the highway. He was running from something that shouldn't have been there, something that knew him, that looked like him, that had somehow left a piece of him behind. The brass lighter on his dashboard, the one he'd lost weeks ago. A perfectly logical man, and this was an impossible reality. He drove for another hour, the rhythm of the road a hollow comfort. The windshield wipers were a metronome for his mounting anxiety. He tried to think, to find a crack in the logic, a reason for the things he had seen, a trick of the light, a stranger who looked eerily similar, a hallucination brought on by fatigue. He was a truck driver, not a ghost hunter. He was practical, grounded, but a lost object appearing on his dashboard was something he couldn't simply dismiss. The lighter felt cold to the touch, heavy with a weight that was not its own. As the sun began to hint at its arrival, a faint gray light pushing through the clouds, the trees on the roadside began to thin. The rain finally stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflective. Ethan could see his own truck, a dark, hulking beast, mirrored in the road ahead. And in that reflection, for just a moment he saw it, a figure, standing behind his trailer. He slammed on the brakes, the big rig shuddering to a halt. The air brakes hissed, the sound cutting through the morning stillness. He reached for the handle, his heart pounding in his ears, and threw open the cab door. Cold, damp air rushed in, smelling of wet leaves and pine needles. He jumped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a thud. Nothing. The road behind him was empty. No car, no person. Just a long, black ribbon of highway disappearing into the distant mist. He walked to the back of the trailer, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. He ran his hand over the metal. The cold surface slick with moisture. He felt a shiver. There was nothing. He must have been imagining things. The lack of sleep, the stress of the road. It was getting to him. He was tired. That was all. He climbed back into the cab, a little shaken, but with his composure beginning to return. He sat down, took a deep breath, and looked in the rearview mirror, checking one last time. The man was sitting in the passenger seat. He hadn't been there a second ago. He hadn't opened the door. He was just there. His legs were crossed, his hands resting in his lap. He was wearing the same black jacket and baseball cap, but the jacket was now open, revealing a faded plaid shirt underneath. His head was tilted slightly to the side, and he was looking straight at Ethan with those empty, identical eyes. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He was frozen, a statue of pure, unadulterated fear. The man didn't move. He didn't blink. He just sat there, as if he had been there all along. The silence was unbearable. It stretched out, a thick, suffocating blanket of dread. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic drum solo in his chest, and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of the man breathing. The air in the cab grew heavy and thick. Then, the man slowly lifted a hand. He pointed to the dashboard, to Ethan's hand, which was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He then pointed to his own hand, holding the lighter. He tilted his head further, a small, unsettling smile forming on his lips. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His voice, a low whisper that seemed to come from all around, filled the cab. "You're always losing things." Ethan's mind screamed. He tried to grab the door handle, to escape, but his hand wouldn't move. It was glued to the steering wheel. He tried to close his eyes, but they were held open, forced to stare at the man who was his own reflection. The man was a mirror image, a perfect copy, except for the eyes. His own eyes, Ethan knew, were filled with terror. The man's were just empty. The man's smile widened just a fraction. He put the lighter back on the dashboard, his movements slow and deliberate. Then, he leaned forward, his face inches from Ethan's. "Don't worry," the man whispered, his voice a dry, papery sound. "I'm just a part of the journey." And in an instant, he was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The air felt lighter. Ethan slumped back in his seat, gasping for air. His body was trembling violently. The lighter was still there on the dashboard, gleaming in the pale morning light. He stared at it, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He was no longer a practical man. He was no longer a simple man. He was a man who had seen an impossibility, a man who was now haunted by his own reflection. The journey was not over. It had just begun. Ethan sat motionless in the cab, the sun now high, casting a jaundiced light over the pine forest. He had been there for hours, just sitting, frozen, the picture of his wife and daughter on the dashboard, once a source of strength, now looked alien, as if it belonged to another life. He felt disconnected from that world, trapped here, in a cab that smelled of stale coffee and fear. He stared at the brass lighter. It lay there, heavy and absurd. It was proof, tangible proof of the impossible. He remembered the voice. You forgot this. A low, raspy voice that was his own. The voice he'd heard whenever he coughed a dry cough at night, or muttered small curses at a broken radio. He had heard his own voice, coming from a copy of himself. It had shattered his world. His entire life, built on a foundation of logic and fact, had crumbled. He was no longer simple Ethan, who believed in what he could see. He was a pawn in a game he didn't understand. He trembled, unscrewed the thermos, and poured a cup of cold, thick coffee. He brought the mug to his lips, but instead of drinking, he inhaled that familiar smell, the smell of an ordinary day, the scent of his old life. He had hoped it would give him a little calm, a little normalcy. It didn't. He made a decision. He would go back to the gas station, back down the road he had come from. He would confront it. Whatever this was, he would face it. He couldn't run forever. He couldn't live like this. He started the truck. The engine roared to a heavy life. He turned the rig around, heading back down the road he had just traveled. The long miles passed. Every pine tree looked the same. Every curve was a duplicate. The familiar loneliness of the road settled in again. But this time, it was no comfort. Every tree could be a hiding place. Every shadow could be a trap. He checked his rearview mirror every few minutes, waiting, his heart a frantic drum. About 15 miles later, he came to the gas station. It looked exactly as he had left it. A small blue building with a pump island outside. Another truck was fueling up. Everything was eerily normal. There was no one. No copy of him. No nameless man. He drove past, slowly, taking it all in. He saw a man in a black jacket working at the station, bent over a pump. He let out a sigh of relief. Maybe he had been mistaken. Maybe it had all been a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. Maybe the lighter. Maybe he had dropped it in the cab, and his mind, in its panicked state, had invented a wild story. He gave a weak, mirthless laugh. He'd done this to himself. He just needed to get to a motel, get some solid sleep, and everything would be fine again. He drove on, a growing sense of relief washing over him. He decided he would drive a few more miles until he got to the nearest town. But then, he saw it, on the right side of the road, a charred patch of earth, and a rusted black truck wreck lying on its side, blackened. He had passed it 100 times before, but he had never looked closely. This time, he did, and a feeling of icy dread spread through his entire body, because he recognized the truck, his truck, lying on its side, blackened, and next to it, on the ground, was a leather wallet. He knew it. He had given it to his wife to hold on to. It had the same scuffs, the same faded marks. He slammed on the brakes. He threw open the cab door, got out, and walked to the burned-out wreck. He bent down, and he saw his name etched on the face of the lighter. This was proof, not a bad dream. This was real. And then, he heard a voice, a low, raspy voice. You've been missing for 2 weeks. He turned around. A woman stood there, staring at him with an empty expression. I found your truck, she said. I'm a local sheriff. We've been looking for you. Everyone thought you were dead. He stared at her, unable to speak. We found a body, she said, pointing to a covered object nearby, lying on the ground. But it wasn't you. It had no face. He stared at her, then at the body. A cold feeling spread through his entire body. Who are you? He asked, his voice trembling. She stared at him, saying nothing. Then, she pointed to an object that lay on the ground, nearby. It was a photograph of a man driving a truck, inside the cab. A man he couldn't recognize. He was smiling. He ran. That was all Ethan knew. He left the wreckage behind, left the woman in the uniform and the faceless body. He ran, not from what he had seen, but from what he had become. A ghost. A duplicate. He ran back to his truck, the truck he wasn't sure was his anymore. He slammed the door shut, locking it. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He couldn't. He drove. He drove for hours, in a fugue state. The road before him now felt like an endless tunnel, and he was a trapped rat. He tried to call his wife, but there was no signal. He tried the radio, but there was only static, occasionally broken by distorted voices, as if they were speaking to him from a great distance. He began to realize a terrifying truth. There was no one else on this road. Not another car, not another light, either in front of him or behind. It was only him, the truck, and the darkness. He passed dozens of small towns, but they were all empty. The streetlights were on, but the shops were closed. There were no cars parked. A ghost town, but not one created by time or neglect. It was made for him alone. He pulled over at an old roadside diner, a place that should have been bustling. He got out of the truck, taking a deep breath. The air was cold and still. He walked into the diner, and a bell on the door jingled, the sound echoing in the empty space. The tables and the bar were clean. The coffee was hot in the pot. It looked as if someone had just left. Only seconds ago, he poured himself a cup, feeling its familiar warmth. And then, he saw it. A small note lay on the bar, next to a steaming mug of coffee. He picked it up. It was handwritten, in a neat cursive. "I've been waiting for you." His heart hammered. It was his handwriting. He turned his head, looking at a booth. A leather wallet, the exact one he had seen on the road. He picked it up, and inside he saw a photograph of a man and a woman, smiling at each other. It was him and his wife, but in the photo, his wife was pregnant. He didn't have a child. What had he done? What was happening? Where had he gone? What life had he run from? He heard a small sound from behind him, the scrape of a wooden chair on the floor. He slowly turned around, and he saw a man sitting at the last table. It was him, not a copy, not an image. It was an older version of himself, tired, quiet, filled with a profound sadness. "I knew you'd come back." His voice, but older, echoed in the empty space. Ethan stood there, unable to speak. "Did you find the lighter?" his older self asked. "And the wallet? The life you lost?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't understand." His older self smiled sadly. "You will. You've met me once before, on the road. I was standing there, waiting for you to come back, because I took a different path, a path you don't know." "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "I'm you," his older self said, and he pointed to the photograph in Ethan's hand. "And this is the life you were supposed to have, the life you gave up." "How did I give it up?" Ethan asked. "You were driving too fast," his older self said. "You weren't paying attention. You weren't looking in your mirrors." Ethan turned to look at his truck, and he saw something, a large crack on the window, a crack he had never seen before, a crack in the shape of a hand. The crack was not a crack. It was a shatter, a web of fractured lines spreading from a single, central point on the window, the shape of a hand, and within the broken glass, a distorted reflection of Ethan's own terrified face. He slowly lifted his hand, his fingers tracing the cold glass, and they fit perfectly into the shape of the print. The crack wasn't just a mark. It was an imprint of his own desperate grasp. He turned back to the man who was his future, but the man was gone. The old wooden chair was empty. The photograph of his pregnant wife lay on the table, a testament to a life he didn't recognize, a happiness he had never known. The coffee in his mug had gone cold. The diner was silent again, impossibly so. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping thing that wrapped around his heart. He wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't crazy. This was real. The man in the cab, the wrecked truck, the sheriff, the photograph. It was all happening. It was all true, and he was a part of it, trapped inside a nightmare that was his own life. He stumbled out of the diner, the bell on the door jingling an empty, mournful tune. He got back into his truck, his hands shaking so violently he could barely put the key in the ignition. He had to get out of here. He had to find a real road, a real town, with real people. He had to find his way back to his life. He drove on, the highway a familiar, endless ribbon stretching into the darkness. But the road was no longer familiar. The signs were different, the exits leading to places he had never heard of. The trees on the side of the road began to change, their branches twisting into strange, unnatural shapes. The air grew colder, and a thin, swirling mist began to creep across the asphalt. He saw lights ahead, a cluster of them, a beacon in the darkness. He felt a desperate surge of hope, a real town, a chance to escape. He sped up, the engine roaring in protest. As he got closer, he realized it wasn't a town. It was a cluster of cars, all pulled over on the side of the road, their hazard lights blinking a silent, frantic rhythm. He slowed down, his heart pounding. People were standing around, looking at something on the road. As he got closer, he realized what they were looking at. A wrecked car, a family car, a sedan, crumpled like an aluminum can, and a man standing by the side of the wreck with a single, dark tear rolling down his face. The man looked up as Ethan's truck approached, and his eyes met Ethan's. They were filled with an expression that was not fear or sadness, but something far worse. It was a look of utter, hollow despair. And then Ethan saw the man's face, the same face he saw every morning in the mirror, the face of the man who had been in his cab, the face of the man in the photograph, the man who had been sitting in the diner. He was a perfect match, the man who was his own reflection. But this time, the man was not alone. Next to him, a woman was sobbing, holding a small child's hand, and Ethan felt a cold, sharp pain in his chest as he recognized them. His wife, his daughter, the daughter he never had. The man, his other self, slowly lifted his hand and pointed to the wrecked car, then to Ethan's truck, and then his lips moved. They formed a single, final word: help. Story 2. The Forbidden Room. Clara was an artist, a painter of landscapes and portraits, a seeker of light and beauty. She was a practical soul, with little patience for superstitions or ghostly tales. She was new to the city, and in her search for an affordable place, she found herself in a sprawling, old Victorian house. The rent was impossibly low, a fact that should have made her suspicious, but the house had a quiet charm that drew her in. High ceilings, a grand, sweeping staircase, and a sense of history that felt more comforting than creepy. The landlady, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, was kind, if a little strange. She was frail and quiet, her eyes a watery blue that seemed to hold a century of stories. She showed Clara around the house, speaking in a whispery voice. The kitchen was on the first floor, a communal space. The living room, filled with dusty furniture, was off limits. Her own bedroom was on the second floor, a cozy little space with a window that looked out onto a small, overgrown garden. But as they reached the end of the long, dark hallway on the second floor, Mrs. Gable stopped. Her whisper grew even softer, almost a breath of sound. "This one," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This door. You must never open it." Clara looked at the door. It was a simple, wooden door, just like all the others. There was no lock on the outside, but it was sealed with a single, ancient iron bolt rusted shut. It looked like it hadn't been opened in 100 years. "What's in there?" Clara asked, her voice hushed by the landlady's strange tone. "It is not for you to know," Mrs. Gable said, turning her back to the door, as if the sight of it was too much to bear. "It is forbidden. Do not try to open it. Do not even look at it too long. It is a promise you must make to me." Clara, amused by the dramatic flair of the old woman, agreed. It was just an old house with a quirky owner. There was a secret room, a dusty old storage closet perhaps. She wasn't a child. She had no intention of breaking a simple rule. She moved in that afternoon, unpacking her boxes and setting up her easel. The house was peaceful. The quiet hum of the old building was a comforting background noise as she painted. The first night, she fell asleep quickly, lulled by the gentle rain against her window pane. But the second night, things were different. She heard a sound, a faint whisper, a soft scratching, as if someone were running their nails over a wooden surface. It seemed to be coming from the end of the hallway, the forbidden room. She sat up in bed, listening. The scratching stopped. She convinced herself it was just the old house settling, the sounds of wood expanding and contracting. She was tired. Her imagination was getting the better of her. She closed her eyes and tried to go back to sleep. But then, the scratching started again, louder this time. It was a rhythmic sound, like someone was trying to write something on the wood. She got out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She crept to her door, a sliver of light coming from the hallway. The scratching was unmistakable now. It was a deliberate, insistent sound. It came from behind the forbidden door. A feeling of unease washed over her. She took a deep breath and tiptoed down the hallway. She stood in front of the forbidden door. her hand hovering just inches from the surface. The scratching was so close now. She could feel the vibration in the air. She pressed her ear to the wood. She could hear it, and she could hear a faint, low breathing from the other side. A slow, deliberate breath. She pulled her ear away, her blood turning to ice. A rational part of her mind screamed at her to go back to her room, to leave it alone. But another part, a curious, primal part, felt a strange pull. She had to know. She had to see. She had to understand what was behind the door. She reached out, and slowly, tentatively, touched the door. It was cold, colder than the air in the hallway, colder than it should have been. And as she touched it, the breathing on the other side stopped. The scratching stopped. A profound silence fell over the house, so absolute and so deep that she could hear the frantic pounding of her own heart. And then, a small, hollow voice, a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, came from inside. "You're not supposed to be here." Clara froze. She stumbled back, falling against the wall, her mind reeling. She didn't wait to hear more. She scrambled back to her room, locked the door, and pushed the dresser in front of it. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. She sat in the darkness, staring at the floor, listening to the silence, listening to her own panicked breathing, waiting for a sound that never came. But the next morning, when she finally crept out of her room, she saw something on the door. On the wood, right next to the rusted iron bolt, there were 3 faint scratches, thin and delicate, as if made by a human fingernail, and beneath them, a single word, carved into the wood. "Help." The word was etched into the wood, just beneath 3 long, delicate scratches. "Help." Clara stared at it, her mind reeling, trying to make sense of the impossible. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and traced the letters. The wood felt rough under her fingertips, a tangible reality that her mind wanted to reject. The scratch marks were not new. They were old, graying with age, as if someone had been carving that word into the door for years. She tried to rationalize it. A cruel joke. A tenant who had moved out years ago. But the scratches were right where she had put her hand the night before. And the sound, the breathing, it had been real. She retreated to her room, locking the door behind her, and sat on her bed, her heart a frantic drum. She wanted to scream, to run, to call the police. But what would she tell them? "There's a door in my hallway that a ghost is scratching on." They would think she was crazy. She decided to talk to Mrs. Gable. The old woman had a key to the forbidden room, after all. She would know what was happening. She would have an explanation. She tiptoed down the stairs, the old wood groaning beneath her feet, and found Mrs. Gable in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she made tea. The old woman looked up, her watery blue eyes seeming to hold a silent question. "Mrs. Gable," Clara began, her voice a hushed whisper, I heard something last night, from the room at the end of the hall." The forbidden room. Mrs. Gable's face went pale. The spoon in her hand clattered to the floor. "You must not go near that door," she said, her voice sharp and filled with a fear that Clara had not expected. "You made a promise." "But I heard something," Clara insisted. "I heard a scratching sound. And a voice. It said I wasn't supposed to be there. And then this morning, there was a word scratched into the door. Help." The old woman's eyes widened in a mixture of horror and sadness. She shook her head, a single, silent tear, tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "Don't you see?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's a mirror, a reflection of what's inside. And what's inside? It's a part of me." Clara's mind reeled. "I don't understand. When I was your age, I was an artist too," Mrs. Gable said, her gaze distant, as if she were looking at a memory. "I was full of life and light, but I fell in love with a man who was full of darkness. He consumed me. He made me feel small. He took away my creativity, my laughter, my very soul. I became a shell of a person." She paused, taking a long, shaky breath, and I began to draw things in my sketchbook. Horrible things, dark things. My art became a reflection of my soul, a record of my pain. And as my pain grew, my art became more real. It started to bleed into my world. The figures in my drawings started to move. The shadows in my sketches began to lengthen. My art, it became alive. I was so afraid. she continued, her voice trembling. I found a way to seal the part of me that was drawing those things. I sealed her away. In that room, that part of me. The part that creates. And the part that holds all the darkness and pain. I locked it away so it couldn't hurt anyone else. Clara stared at her, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. You locked up a part of yourself? Yes, the old woman said, looking at Clara with a look of desperate sorrow. I locked her in that room. The part of me that wants to create but is too full of pain to create anything beautiful. She just sits there, with her sketchbook, and she draws the outside world. She draws the people who come to this house. She draws the fear she feels, the fear she sees in them. And the scratches? Clara whispered, her mind piecing together a terrifying truth. She's trying to get out, Mrs. Gable said. She's been trying for years. She wants to be a whole person again, even if it means destroying everything in her way. She wants to be an artist again, but she can only create fear. A chill ran down Clara's spine. The word help scratched on the door. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a plea from a ghost. It was a plea from a broken soul. And the handprint she had seen, a reflection of her own terrified face, that wasn't a reflection at all. It was the face of the artist, inside the forbidden room, desperately trying to get out. And then she remembered the voice, that hollow, small voice that was both a whisper and a scream. It had said, "You're not supposed to be here." The artist had not been talking to her. She had been talking to Mrs. Gable. Clara walked out of her room, her feet feeling like lead, each step echoing in the static silence of the house. Mrs. Gable's words played on an endless, terrifying loop in her mind. It's a part of me. A woman had locked a part of her soul away in a room, and that part had spent years trying to get out. The horror of it went beyond any ghost story she had ever heard. It was the horror of a fractured mind. She made her way downstairs, the old wooden steps groaning beneath her weight. Mrs. Gable was no longer in the kitchen. The room was empty, but the kettle was still on the stove, steaming. Everything was in its proper place. Everything was terrifyingly normal. Clara made her way to the front door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. She had to leave. She had to run from this house, from that woman, and from whatever was trapped in that room. She was too terrified to stay, but as she opened the door, she saw a woman standing on the porch. It was Mrs. Gable, but not the Mrs. Gable she had known. This woman was younger, more beautiful, and her eyes were no longer sorrowful. They sparkled with life, but also with a strange, frantic madness. She didn't say a word. She just stared at Clara, a strange smile on her lips. Clara recoiled, her hand gripping the doorknob. "Who are you?" she whispered. The younger Mrs. Gable laughed. "I'm Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice energetic and vibrant. "I've been here, trapped, for a very long time. But, Mrs. Gable, you're old," Clara said, her voice trembling. "That's a lie," she said, and she gestured back at the house. "They locked me in here. They told me I couldn't leave, that I couldn't draw, that I couldn't create. But I found a way." Clara looked at her, then back at the house. "What did you do?" "I drew a door," she said, and she pointed at the door behind Clara. "An escape. I drew it in a sketchbook and I waited for someone to be curious enough to open it." Clara stared at the door, and she realized a horrifying truth. This wasn't the front door. This was a drawing, a painting. The house was not real. This entire house was a beautiful, terrifying illusion. "You drew it," the younger Mrs. Gable said, "and you will be here. You will be the one in charge of the story. You will tell my story. You will continue to draw what I couldn't." Clara backed away, unable to speak. She looked at the pictures on the walls and she realized they were not photos. They were drawings. Drawings of the people who had lived here. And in every drawing, the eyes were empty and filled with a silent hatred. She saw herself in one of the drawings. She was standing there, staring at a locked door. She couldn't recognize herself. She had become a part of the collection. "They're all here," the younger Mrs. Gable said. "All the people who tried to run. They're all trapped in my drawings." Clara stared at the woman, and she realized that this woman was not the one speaking. Her voice was another voice, a low, raspy voice. "You're not Mrs. Gable," Clara said. "No," she said. "I'm the one who drew you. I'm the artist." Clara stood there, paralyzed. She was not in a house. She was in a painting, a drawn world, brought to life, vivid and grotesque. The woman before her was not Mrs. Gable, but the artist, a trapped entity who had used her art to create an illusion. And now, Clara was a part of it. "You've seen," the low, raspy voice said, coming from the younger woman. "You've seen the truth. Now you are part of it." Clara looked down at her hands. Her drawing pencil was still there, but the tip was worn down, as if she had been using it for a very long time. Her hands were shaking. She was an artist. She had come here to find a place to create, and now she had found it, but not in the way she had expected. "They all came," the artist said, pointing at the paintings on the wall. "The curious ones, the explorers, they all got trapped here, in my creations. And now, so have you." Clara felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her head. She looked at the paintings on the walls, and she saw herself in them, trapped in frames. She saw herself laughing. She saw herself crying. She saw herself drawing. She couldn't run. She couldn't do anything. She was just a character in a painting. "But there is a way out," the artist whispered, her voice becoming dangerously soft and inviting. "You can draw an escape. You can draw a door. All you have to do is find a blank sketchbook. The one I used to draw this world." Clara stared at her, a glimmer of hope sparking in her heart. "Where is it?" "It's in the room. In the forbidden room," the artist said, and she smiled a gruesome smile. "But you cannot go in there. You cannot." Clara backed away, staring at the woman. A trick. A trap. She wanted her to go into that room. The room where Mrs. Gable had locked herself away. The room where creativity was twisted into a grotesque horror. "No," Clara said. "I can't." "You must," the artist said. "Otherwise you'll be trapped here forever. Like them. Like me." Clara stood there, and a heavy weight settled on her shoulders. The battle wasn't with the room. The battle was with herself, with her own creativity, with her own art. If she didn't face the horror in that room, she would be trapped forever. She turned her back on the woman. She walked down the hall one step at a time. She looked at the painting on the wall, and she saw herself walking down the stairs, the paintings staring at her with their empty eyes. She reached the end of the hallway. The forbidden door was there, locked with a rusted iron bolt. She placed her hand on the door. It was cold as ice, but this time she was no longer afraid. She felt a strange pull, an urge to draw, to create, to face the horror. She slowly opened the door and stepped inside. Inside, the room was empty. No furniture, no objects, only a large mirror, propped up on a wooden stand. And in the mirror, she saw a woman, an old version of Mrs. Gable, sitting on the floor, staring at her with empty eyes. And next to her, there was an open sketchbook. Clara stepped inside. The fear was gone, replaced by a heavy, irresistible urge. The room was empty, save for a large mirror on a wooden stand, and an old woman, sitting on the floor with her back to her. The woman was Mrs. Gable, but not the Mrs. Gable Clara had known. She was older. Her hair was a ghostly white. Her skin was a map of wrinkles. She didn't move. She just sat there, an open sketchbook on her lap. Clara approached, one slow step at a time. She looked at the mirror, and she saw a version of herself, but it wasn't her reflection. She saw an older version of herself, with hollow eyes. Clara knew that if she looked into the mirror for too long, she would be trapped. She knew that she would become a part of the painting. She looked at the sketchbook. It was the one she had heard about in Mrs. Gable's story, the one the artist had used to draw this world into existence. Clara knew that to get out, she had to draw an escape. She had to create a door. She took a pencil from her pocket, one she had carried with her all along. She slowly knelt down, and she began to draw. She drew a door. She drew a small door, with a brass knob and a wooden frame. She drew a door that led to the outside world. She didn't care what she was drawing anymore. She only cared about finishing it. She drew a picture of a door, and when she was done, she felt a strange pull, an urge to open the door. She slowly reached out, and she touched the drawing. She felt a cold sensation. The drawing was coming to life. The door was opening. She looked inside, and she saw a world of light and color, a world she knew. Clara turned to look at Mrs. Gable. and the old woman was gone. The mirror was gone too. She was in a new world, a world of her own creation. But then, she felt another hand. It was cold and wet. It was placed on her shoulder. She slowly turned around, and she saw a version of herself, standing there. This version of her had no eyes. Her face was a blank canvas. She was holding a paintbrush, and she began to paint, on Clara's face, over her eyes, over her mouth, and Clara could not move. She could only stand there, feeling the paintbrush move across her skin. She felt her skin grow stiff, and she could not breathe. And when she was done, Clara could no longer see. She could only feel the hand, and a whispered voice, a low, raspy voice. Now, you are a work of art, too. Story 3. The Curse of the Night Watcher. The road into Briar Hollow stretched endlessly, a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through pine and cedar. For hours, Daniel Mercer had driven with the radio silent, only the hum of tires on the pavement and the occasional sweep of headlights over skeletal tree trunks keeping him company. He wasn't running away, or so he told himself. He was starting over. That was the phrase his sister used when she hugged him goodbye in Portland. Starting over. But the truth pressed heavier than the boxes in the back of his truck. He'd left behind more than an apartment. He'd left behind a divorce, a career stalled by too many mistakes, and a city that seemed determined to spit him out. The Forestry Service had been hiring, and Briar Hollow needed a ranger, someone willing to live in near solitude and maintain trails that tourists rarely touched. The position came with a cabin, an old radio set, and miles of dark woods. Daniel had signed the papers faster than he should have. By the time he reached the ranger station, night had already folded over the forest. The building looked older than the photographs, a squat structure of timber beams and stone, its roof sagging slightly, as though burdened by the weight of years. A single light glowed in the office window. Inside, the smell of damp paper and stale coffee hung in the air. Maps lined the walls, their edges curling. Behind a desk sat an old man, his ranger uniform faded almost to gray. His name tag read, Harlan Wicks. Harlan looked up as Daniel stepped inside. His eyes were pale, washed-out blue, sharp in a face carved by time and weather. "You're the new one," Harlan said, not as a question but as a statement. His voice rasped like dry bark. Daniel offered a handshake that the old ranger ignored. Daniel Mercer, reporting for duty. "Oh," Harlan studied him for a moment, then returned his gaze to the logbook he was filling out. "You'll take cabin 4. Last ranger left it in decent shape. Keys are on the hook by the door." Daniel glanced at the wall. A ring of brass keys hung from a rusted nail. "Appreciate it." Harlan didn't respond. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint ticking of a clock. Then, without looking up, Harlan added, "You'll want to keep your lantern lit at night. These woods don't take kindly to the dark." Daniel almost laughed but caught himself. The man's tone wasn't joking. "Noted," he said instead. As he turned to leave, Harlan's voice followed him. "And if you hear someone walking outside your cabin, don't open the door. Ever." Daniel drove the remaining mile to cabin 4, gravel crunching under his tires. The structure emerged from the trees like something forgotten. A squat log cabin, its porch sagging slightly, its windows reflecting only the black of the forest. When he killed the engine, the silence rushed in, thick, oppressive. He unloaded his boxes quickly, eager to get inside before the cold deepened. The air had a strange bite to it, not just the chill of autumn, but something sharper, almost metallic. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and dust. A stone fireplace yawned at one wall, though no wood had been stacked. The furnishings were simple: a cot, a table, a pair of chairs. Someone had left a lantern on the table, its glass smudged with soot. Daniel lit it, and the room bloomed into a soft amber glow. Shadows crept along the log walls, restless in the flicker. For a while, he busied himself with unpacking. It felt mechanical, moving shirts into drawers, setting a coffee mug on the shelf, placing his ranger-issued radio on the table. Yet every few minutes, his attention snagged on the window. Beyond the glass, the forest pressed close an unbroken wall of trunks and branches. When the wind moved, it sounded like a whisper, as if the trees spoke among themselves. By midnight, Daniel had settled onto the cot with a book, though his eyes skimmed the same page again and again. He couldn't shake the weight of Harlan's warning. If you hear someone walking outside, don't open the door. The forest groaned. The lantern hissed, and just as Daniel's eyes began to close, there came the faintest crunch of footsteps in the gravel outside. The footsteps outside the cabin stilled as suddenly as they had begun. Daniel froze, the book sliding shut in his lap. He held his breath, listening. Nothing, only the wind threading through the pines. Only the faint creak of the cabin settling on its beams. He waited a full minute before letting the air out of his lungs. Just the woods, he muttered. Deer, maybe elk. The sound of his own voice helped, though it rang hollow in the small room. He stood, crossed to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. Lantern light spilled across the porch, catching motes of dust in the glass. Beyond that blackness, the trees were a wall, unbroken, their branches swaying like slow-moving arms. Daniel told himself it was nothing, but the moment triggered something he'd pushed from memory. A story, overheard weeks earlier, at a diner off Highway 22. He'd been eating alone, hunched over a plate of eggs and bacon, when two men in flannel jackets struck up a conversation in the booth behind him. Their voices carried, low and gravelly. He hadn't meant to listen, but solitude made an eavesdropper of anyone. Still don't go out there, not past dusk, one man had said. Briar Hollow's got its keeper. Always has. The night watcher, the other replied, almost whispering the words. That's what my granddad called him. Said you can hear his boots in the gravel, circling the cabins, testing the doors. Daniel remembered smirking at the time, stirring his coffee. Superstition, folklore, the kind of tale small towns nursed like an old scar. He hadn't thought of it again until now, standing in a cabin surrounded by restless trees, the echo of phantom footsteps in his ears. He let the curtain fall back into place and rubbed his arms against the chill. Don't open the door, Harlan had warned. Ever. Daniel set the lantern closer to the window, its glow pushing back against the dark, then returned to his cot. Sleep, however, did not come easily. When it did, it came shallow and strange. He dreamed of the forest, tall trunks closing in, their bark scored with deep scratches. Between them moved a figure always at the edge of sight, always retreating when he turned. Boots struck the ground in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Then came the sound of knuckles rapping against wood. A knock at the cabin door, slow and deliberate. He reached for the handle, and woke. The lantern had gone out, its glass smoked with soot. The cabin lay in darkness, the air cold enough to bite. For a moment Daniel couldn't move, paralyzed by the dream's residue. Then he heard it, a faint dragging sound across the porch, like something heavy being pulled just out of sight. He sat up, pulse thudding. It's just animals, he whispered. His voice quavered, betraying the lie. The dragging stopped. Silence pressed in, thick as snow. Daniel forced himself to lie back down, though he kept his eyes open until dawn's thin light filtered through the curtains. Morning brought little relief. The forest looked less threatening in daylight, its colors sharpened to greens and golds. Yet when Daniel stepped onto the porch, he found the gravel disturbed in strange, circular patterns, as though someone had paced there for hours. Among the prints' boot marks, large and deep, his stomach tightened. No one should have been out here. Cabin 4 sat nearly a mile from the station, the road little more than a rough track. Visitors didn't wander this far. Daniel crouched, brushing his fingers over the indentations. The soil was cold, the impressions sharp-edged, fresh. He straightened quickly and scanned the trees. They loomed silent, indifferent, but he couldn't shake the sensation that eyes watched from somewhere among the trunks. The story from the diner returned with unwelcome clarity. The night watcher, circling the cabins, testing the doors. Daniel's hands curled into fists. Fairy tales, he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. He turned and went back inside, determined to bury himself in work trail maps, radio checks, anything to anchor him in routine. But even as the hours passed, he felt it, a presence lingering just beyond the tree line, patient as the shadows that grew longer toward evening. By the third day, Daniel had learned the rhythm of the forest. Morning dew clung to the grass like glass beads. Ravens gathered on the fence posts, their cries harsh, as though mocking. Afternoons carried the smell of damp moss and smoke from far-off lightning strikes. It was work that kept him sane. He hiked the southern trails, checked signage, logged fallen branches. He forced himself to think of measurements, maintenance, anything to crowd out the memory of Boots pacing outside his cabin. Still, by evening, unease gnawed at him. Tools he'd left on the porch weren't where he remembered. His canteen turned up beneath the cot instead of on the table. Small things, trivial on their own, yet impossible to dismiss. That night, as the lantern flickered low, Daniel gave up trying to sleep. He pulled on his jacket, lit a flashlight, and walked the mile back to the station. Gravel crunched under his boots, echoing louder than he expected. The sound reminded him too much of that first night. The station's light glowed faintly through the trees. Inside, Harlan sat behind his desk, as though he hadn't moved since their last meeting. A thermos steamed at his elbow. "You're restless," Harlan said before Daniel spoke, his tone flat. Daniel leaned against the doorframe. "You could say that." The old ranger's eyes lifted, pale and unreadable. "Cabin giving you trouble?" Daniel hesitated, then forced a laugh. "Guess I'm not used to the silence. Feels like someone's walking out there at night." Harlan's gaze didn't waver. He took a long sip from the thermos, the steam momentarily veiling his expression. When he set it down, he said only, "You'll adjust." "That's it?" Daniel asked, irritation creeping in. "No advice?" "No. Keep your door locked, don't feed the raccoons. Doors don't matter much," Harlan muttered. The words settled like ash. Daniel blinked. "What do you mean?" Harlan shifted in his chair, his uniform creasing like paper. For a long while he said nothing. The clock on the wall ticked. Finally he sighed. "You came here knowing the stories," he said. Daniel frowned. "Stories? Don't play dumb. Folks talk. Diner talk, bar talk. You must have heard about him." Daniel's throat went dry. The night watcher. The boots in the gravel. The knocking. "Just folklore," he managed. Harlan's pale eyes fixed on him. "Folklore is a word city people use when they're too scared to admit the truth." Daniel waited, but Harlan didn't elaborate. The silence stretched until Daniel couldn't stand it. "So what is he? Some ghost? A spirit guarding the forest?" The old ranger's jaw worked, his teeth grinding faintly. When he spoke, his voice dropped to almost a whisper. "He's not guarding it. He's keeping it. There's a difference." The words lodged in Daniel's chest like splinters. Before he could press further, Harlan stood abruptly, gathering the logbook and tucking it under his arm. "You've got work tomorrow. Best get your rest." And Daniel almost protested, but something in the man's expression stopped him. It wasn't just reluctance, it was fear. On the walk back to the cabin, Daniel kept glancing over his shoulder, certain that if he lingered too long, he'd see someone pacing just beyond the glow of his flashlight. When he finally reached the porch, a folded scrap of paper lay at the base of the door. His hands shook as he picked it up. The paper was yellowed, edges frayed, as though it had been there longer than the cabin itself. On it, written in faint pencil, were 3 words: "Keep the light." Morning light leaked thinly through the curtains, painting the cabin in pale gray. Daniel sat at the table with a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, staring at the scrap of paper he'd found the night before. "Keep the light." The words gnawed at him. They weren't written in Harlan's neat, blocky script. This handwriting was jagged, hurried, as though scrawled by someone whose hand shook. He'd left the lantern burning all night, its glow steady against the darkness pressing in. The flame had guttered once or twice, but never gone out. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the trees outside, had kept him awake. Now, in daylight, it felt foolish. He folded the note and shoved it into his jacket pocket. Superstition. That's all it was. Work, he told himself. Work would steady him. The southern trail was overgrown, branches heavy with moss. Daniel moved methodically, clearing debris, hammering in new trail markers. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the chill. Hours passed. Slowly, the rhythm of labor began to dull his unease. Swing, clear, mark. Swing, clear, mark. The simple repetition had a grounding effect. At midday, he rested on a stump, pulling a sandwich from his pack. He switched on his Ranger-issued radio, half expecting static. To his surprise, a voice crackled through. "Copy. You there?" Daniel straightened. "Station, this is Mercer. Reading you." Static hissed. Then faintly a reply. "You shouldn't be here." His blood ran cold. "Say again?" Only static answered. He twisted the knob, scanning channels, but nothing else came through. Finally, he shut it off. the silence of the forest rushing back in. When he returned to the cabin that evening, his boots heavy with mud, something was off. The lantern he'd left on the table now sat on the floor near the door. His cot had shifted a few inches from the wall, and on the table lay his logbook, flipped open to a page he hadn't written. In the same jagged hand as the note were 4 words: "You're not alone here." Daniel's heart hammered. He searched the cabin top to bottom, under the cot, in the small storage closet, even outside beneath the porch. Nothing. The forest stood quiet, innocent. He told himself he'd been careless. Maybe he'd moved the lantern. Maybe the cot had shifted when he sat on it. Maybe. But the handwriting? He had no answer for that. That night, he kept the lantern burning brighter. Every creak of the timbers made him flinch. He tried to write in the logbook, only to find his pen running dry midway through a sentence. When he fetched a new one from his bag, the first pen was gone, simply vanished from the table. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and broken. He dreamed again of boots circling the cabin, but this time they stopped directly at his window. In the dream, he saw the shadow of a figure, tall and still, standing against the curtain. When he woke, the window was open a crack, cold air flowing in. The following morning, Daniel awoke with a stiff neck and a stubborn headache. The window was still ajar, but he convinced himself he must have forgotten to latch it. He had been exhausted, unsettled, his mind probably playing tricks on him. Coffee. That was what he needed. Coffee and a plan. He poured himself a steaming cup and sat at the table, staring at the logbook with its strange handwriting. The words glared back. "You're not alone here." He tapped his pen against the margin. "Stress," he muttered. "Sleep deprivation. People hallucinate all the time under the right conditions." Still, he tore out the page, folded it, and shoved it into his jacket pocket with the first note. He would deal with them later. For now, he would prove to himself that nothing supernatural was happening. He began with the basics. First, he checked the door locks. Solid. No scratches, no signs of tampering. The windows too, though, the old latches stuck sometimes. They were intact. Next, he inventoried his belongings. Nothing stolen, nothing broken. The missing pen? Easily misplaced. The moved lantern? He must have shifted it without noticing. Finally, he swept the perimeter of the cabin, scanning for tracks. The ground was damp with last night's rain, but no fresh prints marred the soil. Not boots, not paws, nothing. It was almost disappointing. On his way back inside, Daniel caught his reflection in the cabin window. His eyes looked strained, ringed with shadows. "Get it together," he told himself. "You're letting campfire stories eat you alive." Still, reason needed evidence. So that evening, he devised an experiment. He wrote a single line in the logbook. "No one but me will read this." He underlined it twice, then drew a star beside it. He placed the pen directly across the open page and set the book dead center on the table. For good measure, he sprinkled a thin line of flour across the cabin threshold. If anyone entered in the night, the marks would show. The preparations calmed him. Science. Observation. If anything happened, there would be proof. Hours passed. He sat at the table, lantern burning, listening to the forest breathe. At first, every rustle set his nerves on edge, but the longer he sat, the more normal it felt. Just the usual nocturnal life of the woods owls, wind, the scurry of small animals. By midnight, his eyelids drooped. He forced himself to stay awake, head propped on his hand. His thoughts blurred. A sound woke him, the faint scrape of gravel outside. His heart lurched, but he stayed put. He would not rush to the door like a frightened rookie. Instead, he fixed his eyes on the logbook, on the pen resting atop the page. The scrape circled the cabin once, twice, then silence. Minutes dragged. Nothing moved. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him. His chin sank to his chest, the lantern's glow smearing into his dreams. Dawn's light pried at his eyelids. Daniel straightened with a groan, stretching the stiffness from his neck. Then he froze. The logbook lay open. The pen was gone. On the page beneath his own line, another had been added. "But I did." The handwriting was the same jagged scrawl as before. Daniel's stomach clenched. He looked to the threshold. The flour lay undisturbed, smooth as when he'd poured it. Not a single footprint marred the white dust. He stood in the quiet cabin, trembling, his rational mind racing. Sleepwalking. That's all. You wrote it yourself. You got up, half asleep, and wrote it. But even as he formed the thought, he knew it wasn't true. The strokes were too foreign, the spacing wrong. And where had the pen gone? His hands clenched into fists. There's an explanation, he whispered. There has to be. The day dragged on under a low ceiling of gray clouds. Daniel forced himself through the motions, checking trails, clearing branches, logging wildlife sightings. The ordinary tasks grounded him, made the events of the night feel distant, almost dreamlike. Almost. Every so often, his hand strayed to the folded notes in his pocket. You're not alone here. But I did. They felt heavier than paper should, like stones pressing against his chest. By evening, the clouds thickened into a mist that clung to the trees. Daniel brewed coffee, set the lantern on the table, and tried to read. But his eyes slid from the page, drawn instead to the window, to the blurred darkness outside. When the knock came, it was so faint he almost convinced himself he hadn't heard it. A single tap, like a branch brushing glass. His heart thudded. He rose, crossed the cabin slowly, and opened the door. The clearing lay silent, mist curling across the ground. No one there. He exhaled sharply, forcing a laugh. Wind. Just the wind. But then he saw it. Between two trees at the edge of the mist. Something stood. At first he thought it was a stump, a shadow warped by fog. But no too tall, too still. It didn't move, didn't sway. He squinted, straining for detail. But the mist refused to yield. No face, no features, just a darker shape carved against the pale background. Daniel gripped the door frame, knuckles white. Hello? He called. His voice cracked on the word. Who's there? Silence. Then he swore he saw it tilt, like a head inclining. The fog thickened, swallowing the shape whole. By the time he blinked, the space between the trees was empty. He shut the door harder than he meant to, then pressed his back to it, chest heaving. His rational mind clawed for purchase. A trick of light, a branch. You've been awake too long. But he knew what he had seen. A presence, a figure, watching. The next morning he hiked into town under the excuse of checking supply deliveries. Really, he wanted answers. Harlan was at the ranger station, sipping coffee, as if the world couldn't trouble him. Daniel dropped into the chair across from him, staring hard. Something's happening out there, Daniel said. At the cabin. Harlan's eyes narrowed, but he didn't look surprised. What kind of something? Daniel hesitated. He wanted to sound sane, rational. He left out the notes, the handwriting. He described the noises, the sense of being watched, the shape among the trees. Harlan listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When Daniel finished, silence hung heavy. Finally, Harlan set down his mug. You ever hear the name Night Watcher before you took this post? Daniel stiffened. He remembered the half-heard bar story, the warnings wrapped in laughter. He nodded once. Then you know the tale, Harlan said quietly. He keeps watch. Always has. Some say he guards the woods. Some say he guards the dead buried here, long before us. Danielle snorted. Ghost stories. Harlan's gaze didn't waver. Maybe. Or maybe not. What you saw last night, don't go looking for it again. It's better if it finds you on its own terms. The words chilled him more than any shape in the fog. That night, Daniel couldn't shake the image. That still, watching figure, the tilt of its head. He told himself it wasn't real. He told himself logic explained everything. But as the cabin creaked and the mist thickened outside, he knew he was lying, if not to Harlan, then to himself. Because once you see the watcher, you never forget. Morning came gray and cold. Daniel dragged himself from bed, his sleep fractured into uneasy fragments. Coffee, he thought. Coffee and a walk. He opened the front door and froze. His axe lay across the porch. He hadn't used it since Sunday. He remembered clear as daylight locking it in the shed. He had even double-checked the padlock, tugging it twice. Yet here it was, damp with dew, handle smeared faintly with mud, as if someone had carried it here through the forest. Daniel's skin crouched. He crouched, fingers hovering above the wood but not touching. Every instinct screamed, don't pick it up. Don't smudge whatever evidence might cling there. Evidence. The word felt oddly grounding. If someone had broken into the shed, left the axe, then it wasn't ghosts. It was a person, which, in some ways, felt worse. The day did not improve. Inside the cabin, things weren't where he'd left them. His lantern stood near the door instead of on the table. His notebook, normally stacked neatly, was half open on the bed. At first he tried to rationalize. He had been tired, distracted. Maybe he'd moved things without remembering. But by afternoon, the excuses grew brittle. Too many items, too deliberate a placement. The lantern facing the door. The notebook spread like someone had been leafing through it. Not random, curious, searching. He carried the axe back to the shed, checked the lock again. Still fastened. No scratches, no signs of tampering. That unsettled him most of all. Late afternoon, he set out along the trail to distract himself. The woods were damp, heavy with mist. Every snapped twig seemed amplified, echoing. Half a mile in, he found prints. Not deer, not bear, boot prints. They trailed along the path, then veered sharply into the undergrowth. Daniel followed for a few paces before stopping. The prints went deeper, away from the marked trail, toward the darker heart of the forest. No ranger had been scheduled here this week. His radio crackled faintly at his side, but when he tried to raise the station, only static answered. By the time he returned, dusk was closing in. The cabin squatted in the clearing like a lonely outpost, lantern light faint in the window. Daniel hesitated before going inside. He had the sudden, irrational conviction that someone was already in there, waiting. But when he opened the door, the cabin was empty, silent. Still, the air smelled faintly different, damp, like earth after rain. He locked the door tight. That night, he sat with his back to the wall, every lamp burning. He tried to read, to distract himself, but his eyes kept drifting to the windows. Every so often, the glass caught a faint reflection, his own face, pale, but sometimes he wasn't sure. A blur, a suggestion of something behind him, gone the instant he turned. And then came the sound, soft, barely audible, footsteps, crunching the gravel around the cabin. Slow, deliberate, circling. The footsteps circled the cabin for what felt like hours, sometimes close, sometimes retreating, always there. Daniel sat rigid in his chair, shotgun balanced across his knees, every muscle coiled. When the first knock came, it nearly sent him out of his skin. 3 sharp raps against the back wall. Not the door, not the windows, the wall itself. Daniel's breath caught. He turned his head slowly, staring at the dark wood paneling behind him. Another 3 knocks. Precise, spaced, almost measured. He gritted his teeth. "Who's out there?" he shouted. Silence answered. Then, from the opposite side of the cabin, another set of knocks. He rose, every nerve screaming, moved to the window, yanked back the curtain. Nothing, just mist, rolling pale under the moonlight. He forced himself back into the chair, tried to steady his hands. But the knocking resumed, always 3 beats, always moving. Back wall, side wall, front porch. A circuit, deliberate like someone pacing the perimeter and striking the wood each time they passed. A ritual, a warning. Daniel's throat was dry. He shouted again, voice hoarse. "This is ranger property. You're trespassing." No reply. Only the rhythmic sound. The longer it went on, the more unbearable it became. His mind conjured images, gloved hands, tapping with cold precision, a faceless figure pressing its ear against the walls, testing the boundaries. Finally it stopped. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He dared to hope it was over, and then knuckles on the door. Slow, heavy, boom, boom, boom. He leveled the shotgun. The barrel trembled. The knocking ceased. The silence after was worse. Daniel forced himself to breathe, to think. He edged closer to the door. Every step weighted with dread. His fingers brushed the handle. And then, Daniel, a voice, barely above a whisper, right outside. His blood ran cold. It hadn't been angry. It hadn't been pleading. It had been flat, neutral, like someone reciting his name from memory. He staggered back, heart hammering, shotgun raised. But the porch was empty. The clearing beyond, shrouded in mist, waited in silence. Daniel stood frozen in the center of the cabin, the shotgun heavy in his trembling hands. His breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat, the echo of that voice, his own name, spoken in that strange, toneless cadence still vibrating inside his skull, as though the cabin walls had absorbed it and were whispering it back to him. He wanted to stay put, to bar the door, to sit with his back pressed against the wall until daylight came and dissolved all these phantoms into nothing. But the longer he stood there, the more the silence pressed in, until it felt less like safety and more like suffocation, and he realized with a dawning horror that the cabin was no longer a refuge, but a trap. The door loomed before him, a single barrier of thin wood between his body and whatever intelligence waited in the fog, and he knew without logic, without reason, but with a certainty that chilled him deeper than any winter wind, that if he did not face it now, if he let it circle and knock and whisper without answer, then he would never again know a night's rest, because the waiting would eat him alive. His hand rose, reluctant, slow, as though moving through water, until his fingers brushed the cold metal of the latch, and the instant he felt it, a pulse of adrenaline surged through him so sharp it made his vision swim, and before he could think better of it, before he could even draw a steadying breath, he wrenched the door open. The night met him like a living thing. Mist poured into the doorway, curling around his ankles, damp and cold and faintly metallic in smell, like wet iron. The trees stood at the edge of the clearing, indistinct shapes in a shifting curtain of gray, their branches clawing at the sky, and between them, the darkness deepened until it felt as though the forest had no depth at all, just an endless mouth yawning open to swallow him whole. He stepped forward, shotgun raised, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground, and the moment his foot left the threshold of the cabin, he heard it again, footsteps, faint, deliberate, moving just ahead of him, never too far, never too close, as though drawing him out, one step at a time, into the waiting woods. He paused, listening, heart pounding in his ears, and for a moment he thought the sound had stopped, but then it resumed. And this time he realized with dawning dread that it wasn't a single set of footsteps at all, it was many, overlapping, converging, surrounding, the cadence shifting in the fog as though unseen figures were walking in a slow circle around the clearing. He wanted to retreat, to slam the door shut and bar it forever, but when he turned his head, the cabin seemed suddenly smaller, weaker, its lantern light pale and trembling against the tide of gray. And something inside him whispered that going back would not protect him, not anymore, because the moment he had opened the door, the line had been crossed, and then he saw them. In the soil around the cabin, half obscured by mist and dew, impressions had been pressed deep, overlapping, countless, boot prints, large and small, some sharp and recent, others softened as though they had been standing there for years, maybe longer. They weren't leading toward the cabin, nor away from it. They formed a ring, a closed boundary of footprints encircling the place like the groove of some ancient ritual, as though an endless procession had walked there again and again, keeping watch. Daniel's breath hitched, his body trembling violently, because for the first time since arriving at Briar Hollow, he understood that he had not stumbled into an accident, not caught the attention of some wandering intruder, but instead stepped into the center of something far older, a vigil unbroken, a presence that had been waiting long before he came, and now recognized him, accepted him, claimed him. And in that moment, carried on the wind so soft he almost doubted it, came the whisper again, "Daniel," but this time it did not come from a single voice, but many, layered upon each other, rising and falling like the breath of the forest itself. The morning broke pale and unkind, a colorless wash of light that did nothing to chase away the damp that clung to Daniel's skin, nor the crawling unease that lingered in the back of his skull. He hadn't slept. He had sat at the table, shotgun across his knees, lantern hissing low, eyes fixed on the window until gray dawn bled into the clearing. Only then had the whispers receded, only then had the forest gone still, and he felt, absurdly, like he had been allowed to live until morning, permitted another day under conditions he did not understand. He needed answers. More than that, he needed the comfort of paper, of facts, of something written in ink that would tell him this place was not the shifting dream he feared it had become. So he walked. He locked the cabin door behind him, though the act felt hollow, and set off down the trail toward the ranger station in town. The mist clung to his boots the whole way, reluctant to let him go. The station was nearly empty. A skeleton crew, most of them out on routine patrol. Harlan wasn't there. That suited Daniel just fine. He found himself drifting toward the back of the building, past the coffee-stained counter and the rack of visitor maps, toward the door marked records. The lock was old, rusted, barely more than formality. His key turned with a reluctant click. Inside, the air smelled of paper rot and dust. Metal filing cabinets loomed in rows, their drawers plastered with peeling labels. Incident reports, fire logs, personal. Daniel moved to the last row, where the cabinet sagged slightly on its legs, and tugged open the drawer marked Personnel Archived. The files whispered as he thumbed through them. Names, dates, evaluations. Some he recognized from brief greetings in town, old-timers who had since retired. Others were strangers, gone long before his arrival. And then he saw it. A folder thinner than the rest, tucked between two bulging files as if to hide it. The tab bore a name that made his throat tighten. Edward Mallory. He didn't know why the name struck him so sharply. It carried no weight of memory, no story he could place. But as his eyes traced the letters, he felt the hair on his arms rise, and a heaviness settle across his chest, as if the air itself disapproved of him looking here. He slid the file free. The paper was brittle, yellowing. The first page was routine enough. Mallory had been assigned to Briar Hollow 30 years ago. Responsibilities listed. Cabin location noted, the very same cabin where Daniel now stayed. But the deeper he read, the stranger it grew. Reports of unverified disturbances, noted absences during patrols. Other rangers complained of his behavior. Withdrawn, secretive, claiming he saw lights where there were none. Heard voices when the woods were silent. The file ended abruptly. No retirement date. No transfer. Just a final notation, scrawled at the bottom in a different hand. Less official, more urgent. Missing. Presumed dead. Body never recovered. Daniel's hands shook. There were more notes, handwritten in the margins by some unknown author. He heard them first. Said the watcher followed him back to the cabin. Last words in the log. It knows my name. Daniel stared at the page until the letters blurred. His own memory jolted with cruel clarity, the whisper through the door, soft as breath. Daniel. He slammed the folder shut, his chest heaving. For a long moment he stood there in the silence of the records room, the hum of the fluorescent light above the only sound, and he had the horrible, distinct impression that if he opened the drawer again, if he dared to check the files under his own name, he would find a folder already waiting, already written, the ink not yet dry. Daniel carried the folder back to his cabin like a thief. Every step of the trail felt surveilled, the hush of the trees heavier than usual, as if they disapproved of the weight in his hand. He told himself it was only paper, ink on pulp, yet his grip tightened, knuckles whitening, as though he feared the woods might reach out and snatch it from him. Inside, he bolted the door, set the folder on the table, and lit the lantern against the encroaching dusk. The hiss of the flames steadied him. Paper would make sense. Paper could not whisper, could not stalk, could not rearrange itself. He opened the file. The first page was the same as before. Edward Mallory, assigned to Briar Hollow. He skimmed past the familiar lines, but when he reached the second page, his breath hitched. The typed report was different. Where earlier it had read reports of unverified disturbances, it now said, personal belongings found disturbed in cabin believed to be the work of vandals. Daniel froze. He could see, in memory, the misplaced mug, the boots dragged to the porch, the tools left in places he never left them. His eyes darted to the margins. A note, in the same frantic hand as before, bled through the yellowed paper. He thought it was kids at first. He told himself it was kids. Daniel's mouth went dry. He flipped back a page. Had he misremembered? But no, the first page was intact, unchanged. Only this one had shifted. Slowly, unwillingly, he turned to the next. The report listed Mallory's increasing unease during night patrols. The typed words described sounds of footsteps outside the cabin. Daniel's skin prickled. That hadn't been there earlier. He was certain of it. He remembered the bland phrasing other rangers complained of his behavior. But now the file spoke directly to the dread that had gnawed at him just nights before. when the crunch of invisible steps circled his cabin. In the margin, he tried not to open the door. He lasted longer than most. Daniel pushed back from the table, chair legs screeching against the floor. His chest rose and fell in jagged rhythm. The lantern guttered, shadows clawing higher on the walls. He shut the folder, pressing both palms down on the cover as if to pin it in place. For a long moment he just listened, the crackle of flame, the faint tick of cooling wood, his own ragged breath. When he opened it again, the pages lay waiting, compliant, unchanged. But then he saw it. A new sheet had appeared at the back, crisp, white. The paper did not carry the patina of age, nor the brittle edges of 30 years. It looked fresh, recently typed. At the top, in stark black letters, Incident Report Daniel Hayes. His blood iced. Below, the lines were chillingly familiar. Subject reports misplaced belongings. Subject reports noises outside cabin. Subject shows signs of increasing agitation, loss of rational control. Daniel read the words twice, 3 times, each repetition making them no less real. This was not memory playing tricks. This was not some overlooked form in the folder. The record was updating itself, mirroring his unraveling. And at the bottom, space left for more, the cursor of fate blinking invisible. Pending conclusion. Daniel shoved the file away as though it had burned him. It slid across the table and toppled to the floor, spilling open. Pages fanned out like wings. For a heartbeat, he swore the typed letters writhed, rearranging themselves as he watched, then settled again into silence. He did not sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin seemed echoed in the words he had just read. He imagined the file lying on the floor, silently recording each sound, each movement, cataloging his descent. He imagined that if he dared to check it come morning, there would already be a fresh line at the bottom. Subject reports hearing his own name whispered from the dark, and he would not know if he was remembering an event or predicting one. Daniel did not intend to look again, not after the way the words had mirrored his own unraveling, but the file had a gravity of its own, an almost magnetic insistence, and by midnight he found himself on the floor with the pages spread before him like the bones of some ancient animal, brittle and pale, waiting to be read. He told himself he would only skim, only glance, but his eyes fell to the lower sections, the ones he had avoided, and there, beneath Mallory's increasingly frantic notes, beneath the sterile typeface of government reports that once might have comforted him with their bland indifference, he saw an abrupt end last sighted on patrol, not recovered, the words clinical, detached, almost mercifully vague, as though the truth of what had happened could not be recorded, and yet in the margin a hand had scrawled. He did not come back. He was not meant to. Daniel's throat tightened as he traced the ink, uneven and smeared, perhaps written in haste, perhaps with a hand that shook as badly as his own did now. And then, just below, another sheet, the paper newer, less yellowed, but no less damning, listing another name, someone else he did not know, another ranger assigned years later, who likewise reported strange noises, mislaid belongings, refusal to heed warnings, and again the same conclusion, last observed entering Briar Hollow interior. Not recovered. It was not only Mallory. There had been others. The folder did not preserve their stories in detail, only the fragments, the same arc repeated, the same dread escalating until it broke upon the same line, as if the forest itself required a cycle, demanded a turning of the wheel. One by one the names appeared, some accompanied by half-typed sentences, some already smudged or half-erased, but the pattern unmistakable. Each had stepped into the role, each had vanished, and each had been recorded not by any colleague but by the file itself, updating in silence, in secrecy, as though the woods were keeping its own census. Daniel read until the letters blurred, until the names melted together, and yet he could not stop, because among them he thought he recognized something, his own unease, his own words, the echo of his own fear captured decades before, written by strangers who had lived through the same steps, who had heard the same sounds in the dark, who had woken to the same rearranged belongings, who had resisted, rationalized, told themselves there was no curse, until the forest corrected them. The last page stopped him cold. It bore no date, no signature, only the stark phrase, centered on the page, position filled, awaiting successor, and beneath it, faint, almost erased, a series of names struck through one by one, Mallory's among them, others he did not know, the ink darker with each crossing, as though the hand had grown more forceful, more insistent, with every erasure. At the bottom of the list there was a blank space. Daniel stared at it, unable to look away, knowing, with a clarity that chilled him to the marrow, that the space was not empty at all but waiting, and that the silence pressing in around the cabin was not absence but anticipation, and that the forest, the file, the curse, whatever one chose to name it, was not finished, only patient. Daniel could not endure the weight of that blank space at the bottom of the list, waiting for his name as though the page itself had already drawn him into its orbit, and so in a surge of panic he gathered the scattered papers, shoved them back into the folder with trembling hands, snapped the cover shut as though it might silence them, and hurled the thing into the darkest corner of the cabin, where it landed with a dull, accusatory thud. Then, without pausing, without breath, he dragged on his coat, snatched his pack from its peg, and fumbled with the bolt of the door, telling himself over and over that he was not bound here, not part of some cycle, that he could leave Briar Hollow as easily as he had entered, that the forest could not hold him if he refused to play its game. The night outside was brittle, the stars sharp and cold, the trees hunched close as if listening, and Daniel forced his boots down the path, every step loud in the frozen air, echoing like a declaration, "I will not stay. I will not be written." But as he reached the trailhead, he felt an urge, a compulsion to glance back at the cabin, and in the dim glow of the lantern left burning inside, he thought he saw the folder splayed open on the floor, though he knew he had thrown it shut, and even from this distance he could swear the pages were fluttering, not with the wind, but as though unseen fingers were rifling them, catching up to his departure, recording his defection. He pressed on. The woods were darker than they had ever been, and the familiar markers he had memorized in training, the forked pine, the granite outcrop, the mossy log, seemed subtly wrong, their shapes distorted, their angles skewed, as if the forest had rearranged itself between one heartbeat and the next. He clung to reason, to the map folded in his pocket, but when he drew it out, the paper quivered in his hand, and for one terrible instant he saw words bleeding across it, not topography but sentences, the same sterile typeface as the reports. Subject attempts to leave designated grounds. Subject believes he is in control. Daniel crumpled the map, shoved it away, and stumbled faster down the unseen path, every breath ragged, but the sense only deepened the rustle of leaves, not just wind, but the scratch of pen on paper, the creak of branches overhead, not mere settling wood, but the long, slow sigh of a page being turned. It dawned on him, in a moment of dizzy horror, that his flight was not erasure but inscription, that every frantic step was already being set down somewhere, in some ledger that did not care for his will, his fear, his resistance, only for the shape of the story it had told countless times before, and would tell again. He stopped. He listened, and from far off, almost delicate, almost kind, came the unmistakable sound of paper tearing. Daniel did not remember turning back toward the cabin, did not recall the decision, only that the forest had closed in, the path had thinned to a thread beneath his boots, and at some point the only destination left to him was the dim orange glow pulsing between the trees like the last heart of a dying fire. When he stumbled back into the clearing, the cabin stood as it always had, silent and small and waiting, and though he had thrown the folder into shadow, he found it upright on the table, centered beneath the lantern as if summoned, its cover yawning open in invitation. He told himself not to look, told himself to douse the lamp, to lock the door and wait out the night with ears covered and eyes shut, but the air in the cabin grew heavy with the weight of unsaid words, and he found his hands moving without his consent, found his chair scraping back into place, found himself seated before the spread pages, as though before an altar. The report lay bare before him. The sections he had already read were unchanged. Mallory's disappearance, the nameless successors who had followed, the cycle repeating with cruel economy. But as his gaze drifted downward, to the page that had once held only a blank space, his lungs collapsed in on themselves, for the space was no longer empty. His name was there, not fresh, not recent, not written in any ink distinguishable from the rest. It was embedded, permanent, as though it had been there all along, merely waiting for him to notice. Hayes, Daniel assigned Briar Hollow. Status: not recovered. The words did not glisten with newness. They bore the same faded type as the reports from 30 years past, as if some clerk long dead had already filed him away, as if his fate had not been unfolding but had always been concluded. And in the margin, the same frantic scrawl he had followed from page to page, yet now clearer, steadier. Resigned. You were never replacing him. You were only remembering yourself. Daniel pushed back, knocking the chair onto the floorboards, but the words clung to him, etched into the dark behind his eyelids when he tried to blink them away, carved into the silence between his ragged breaths. He clawed at the folder, at the pages, but no matter which sheet he tore free, no matter which name he tried to shred from the record, his own remained fixed, immutable, the ink refusing to lift, the letters refusing to scatter. The lantern sputtered, its flame shrinking to a nervous pulse, and in that dimness, the walls of the cabin seemed to lean closer, the logs swelling with shadow, the air thickening until it hummed with the sound of a page turning, one slow, deliberate motion, as though the book of his life had reached its inevitable end. Daniel staggered to the door, fumbled at the latch, pressed his forehead to the cold wood, but outside the forest held its silence like a verdict. No wind, no owl, no rustle of leaves, only the weight of a world that had already forgotten him, as though the man who had come to Briar Hollow had never truly existed. Behind him, on the table, the folder lay still. And when the lantern finally died, the cabin did not go dark, for the pages glowed faintly on their own, the ink shimmering like embers, each letter alive with memory, each line already written, until there was no Daniel left to resist, only the record, and the record was complete. Story 4. The Strange Friend App. I always thought of myself as balanced. Not happy, not glowing with joy every second, but balanced. I wasn't lonely, not really. At least, that's what I used to tell myself when people asked how I liked living alone in the city. I would smile, shrug, and say it was fine. And they would nod, satisfied, because that was the answer they expected. But the truth came later. It came in the hours after the streets grew quieter, when office lights across the skyline clicked off one by one, and the city dimmed into a softer, stranger shape. That's when the silence found me. That's when balance faltered. My apartment was small, a one-bedroom box on the 13th floor of a high-rise that loomed over downtown. Not many buildings claim a 13th floor. Some try to skip the number entirely, as if omission can erase superstition. But mine wore the number proudly. Apartment 1304. I told myself I didn't care. It was just a number. But every time I slid the key into that door, every time the elevator chimed and the doors opened onto the 13th floor, something small and cold stirred in me, like I was stepping into a space other people had already rejected. Inside, the air always smelled faintly metallic, like the scent of an old radiator or overheated wires behind the walls. No matter how many candles I lit, vanilla, cedar, lavender, the metallic tang never left. It clung to the corners. It clung to me. At night, I would push open the balcony door, let the cool city wind sweep in. The balcony railing was black iron, slightly rusted, biting cold if you rested your hands there too long. Beyond it stretched the city, endless towers of concrete, glass, and light, pulsing like arteries in some vast mechanical body. Cars streamed in red and white rivers far below. Neon signs blinked in feverish rhythms. Billboards glared with faces too perfect to be real, their eyes frozen in unblinking smiles. And underneath it all was the city's heartbeat, the hum of engines, the gasp of brakes, the stutter of sirens weaving through traffic. I often stood there, a glass of cheap wine in hand, watching, waiting for something impossible, for one of those lit windows across the street to flicker in recognition, for a figure to appear and hold my gaze. Just proof that someone, anyone, was looking back. But nobody ever was. On Friday nights, the weight of it all pressed harder. Offices closed, co-workers vanished into their weekend plans. Laughter echoed in the distance from bars I no longer bothered to enter. I'd return to my apartment, drop my keys on the counter, peel off shoes that pinched my toes, and let the silence rush in like water flooding a chamber. That Friday in October was no different, or at least, it shouldn't have been. I remember tossing my bag onto the sofa, the cushions exhaling dust, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the kitchen. I opened the fridge, stared at the half-empty shelves, told myself I'd order something later, the kind of half-promise you make when you know no one's around to call you on it. That's when it happened. The phone buzzed on the counter, vibrating against the laminate, screen glowing in the dim kitchen. I reached for it, expecting a text, a reminder, a bill, some digital scrap of responsibility. But what I saw made me pause. A notification. White text against black. Discover new friends nearby. Download Find Friend now. It was absurd. Just an ad, just one more in the flood I scrolled past daily. And yet, something about it snagged me. New friends nearby. The words lingered in my mind longer than they should have. They didn't feel like marketing copy. They felt personal, whispered. I laughed, a sound too sharp in the empty kitchen. I set the phone down, went to pull out bread, cheese, anything that resembled dinner, but I kept glancing back at the phone, as though it were waiting for me. Finally, I sighed, slid it open, and tapped. The app's icon was simple, a pale blue circle, a single white dot in the center, like a beacon, like a target. The design was clean, modern, friendly, the sort of aesthetic meant to lower defenses. I installed it, the progress bar filling far faster than seemed normal. Then came the welcome screen. Soft piano notes began to play, repeating in gentle loops. Words appeared, almost tender. Welcome to Find Friend, because nobody should feel alone tonight. I shifted uneasily but told myself it was clever branding. That's all. The setup was quick. Name, age. A photo snapped hastily in the yellow lamplight of my living room. My face shadowed and imperfect. I didn't care. I wasn't here to impress anyone. When the app finally opened, it was a map. My map. A glowing grid of streets I knew, dotted with circles. Each circle pulsed faintly, linked to a user profile. I tapped one. A woman smiling with a cat pressed to her cheek. Normal. Another. A guy in a baseball cap, standing in front of a brick wall. Another. A couple in a cafe, faces pressed close, blurred in laughter. They all looked harmless, forgettable. The kind of faces you pass in a crowd and never think about again. I exhaled, set the phone down, told myself it was boring. Too boring. Maybe I'd delete it later. I went to the fridge again, pulled out a bottle of wine, let the cork squeak against the counter as I twisted it free. Then the phone buzzed. The sound was sharper this time, slicing through the room. I turned. The screen lit the counter like a small stage light. You have a new friend request. Already? My brows lifted. I hadn't even touched the app for 5 minutes. I tapped the notification. The request expanded, name filling the screen. The visitor. No photo. Just a gray circle, empty, anonymous. I scrolled to the About section. It held only 4 words. I like to watch. I froze. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. The city outside groaned with its endless movement, but in that moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. I tapped the location. Instead of listing a distance or an area, it simply read, nearby. My laugh cracked in the quiet. Right, okay, some troll. I spoke aloud, trying to make my voice fill the hollow space. But the words didn't convince me. Not really. My thumb hovered over the decline button. The simplest solution. 1 tap and this would be over. But I didn't tap. I can't explain why. Maybe it was the wine softening my logic. Maybe it was the exhaustion of another week of shallow interactions. Maybe it was something darker, the part of me that stood on the balcony night after night, aching for someone, anyone, to look back. So I left it. A pending request. A hairline crack in the glass. And as I set the phone down again, as the apartment pressed closer, I swear the silence shifted. Subtle, but undeniable. Like the air itself was leaning in, waiting. That was when it began. I wish I could tell you that I deleted the app the moment I felt uneasy, that I trusted my instincts, trusted that tightening in my gut that warned me something was wrong. But I didn't. Instead, I lingered. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was that invisible thread of curiosity that always feels stronger when you know you should cut it. Whatever the reason, I left it there on my phone screen, like a bright little door I could open whenever I felt like it. For a few days, nothing happened. I told myself that was proof I had been overreacting. The app just sat there, benign, tucked between my banking app and my food delivery service. a cheerful green icon with rounded edges, promising connection. Work filled my days, errands filled my evenings, and by the time I came home to my apartment, I was so drained I could barely stay awake. I convinced myself that the strange chill I'd felt, that crawling awareness in my own living room, was just the product of being overtired. Then, late on a Thursday night, I got the first message. I wasn't even on the app at the time. My phone buzzed where it was charging on the nightstand, and I lazily reached for it, half expecting an email from work or some spam notification. Instead, there it was, a message from the app, from the user who called himself the Visitor. "Nice place you've got." That was it. 4 words. Not aggressive, not vulgar, not even obviously threatening, just simple. But it hit me in a way that nothing else had, because how could he know? The profile I'd created didn't list my location. I hadn't shared any photos of my apartment. Nothing about me online, at least nothing I thought would point to this high-rise building tucked into the city grid. I tried to breathe slowly, calmly. I told myself maybe it was a generic message, something he sent to everyone. Maybe it wasn't even directed at me. I set the phone back down, rolled over, pulled the blanket up over my shoulder, and told myself to go to sleep. I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the faint blue glow of the screen until my eyes burned. Every small creak of the building made me flinch. The distant hum of the elevator in the hall sounded too close, like it was stopping on my floor again and again. And in the silence, I realized something. I had never locked the app down. I had never checked the permissions. The next morning, bleary-eyed and buzzing with caffeine, I opened the settings. The app had access to everything: my location, my photos, even my microphone. I stared at the toggles in disbelief, like I had willingly handed over the keys to every corner of my life. My thumb hovered over delete, but I didn't press it. I don't know why. Maybe it was because I wanted to believe I was still in control, that I could manage this. Maybe it was because deleting it felt like admitting defeat, or worse, admitting that something truly was wrong. That evening, I got another message. "Blue is your color." My breath caught in my chest. I was wearing a blue blouse, something I'd picked up on my way home. I hadn't posted about it, hadn't taken a photo. I hadn't even looked at myself in a mirror since I'd put it on. Yet somehow he knew. I sat there on the edge of the couch, phone trembling in my hand, and whispered aloud, "How?" Of course, there was no answer. Not then. Over the next few days, the messages trickled in, never frequent enough to feel like harassment, but always timed so that I couldn't forget he was there. "Did you sleep well? Dinner smells good. Try not to stay up so late." Each one landed like a drop of water against stone, subtle but relentless, carving away at me. I stopped feeling safe in my own apartment. Every time I opened the fridge, every time I drew the curtains, every time I brushed my teeth in the bathroom mirror, I felt watched. The app was like an open window I couldn't close, a silent observer with a smile stitched into its code. I told myself again and again that it was coincidence. Maybe he was guessing. Maybe it was a trick of algorithms, or data scraped from somewhere else online. I grasped at logic like a lifeline, trying to anchor myself in the idea that there had to be a rational explanation. But then came the photo. It arrived late, close to midnight. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, the vibration making the empty glass beside it tremble. I almost didn't look. My nerves were raw from days of little sleep, my body buzzing with too much caffeine, too much anxiety. But I picked it up anyway, and when I opened the app, I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. It was a photo of me, sitting right there on the couch. From behind, the angle was impossible. The shot was framed from across the room, as though someone had stood just inside my apartment, leaned against the far wall, and snapped it. I could see the curve of my shoulder, the way my hair fell, the glow of the television in front of me. I didn't move for what felt like forever. My pulse thundered in my ears. My throat went dry. I couldn't even turn my head, couldn't look behind me, because if I saw someone standing there, it would mean everything was real. When I finally forced myself to move, I bolted. I checked every closet, every corner, every possible place a person could hide. Nothing. I even checked the locks. They were still latched. The windows were sealed. I was alone, or at least I was supposed to be. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat up with every light on, scrolling through forums, desperately searching for answers. I typed in phrases like, friend app creepy messages, and someone knows where I live app privacy. I found scattered stories, threads that had gone dead years ago, people describing something eerily similar, messages that seemed too personal, details no stranger should know. None of the accounts were active anymore. No follow-ups, no explanations, just silence. It felt like a warning. The next morning, my body felt hollow, as if all my strength had drained out through my fingertips. Still, I went to work. I forced myself to go through the motions, smile at coworkers, answer emails, nod at meaningless chatter. But underneath it all was this gnawing awareness. My apartment was no longer mine. When I returned home that evening, something small but undeniable had changed. My shoes, the ones I had left by the door, were gone. Not misplaced, not shifted, gone. I searched everywhere. Bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, even the trash. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to collapse in frustration, I found them, sitting neatly side by side, in the middle of my bed. The air felt thick around me, heavy with a pressure I couldn't name. I stood there staring at the shoes, unable to step closer. They looked like bait. They looked like a message. I didn't touch them that night. I slept on the couch, blanket pulled up to my chin, lights blazing. Every sound in the building seemed amplified, the pipes groaning, the hum of the elevator, the distant slam of someone else's door. Each noise carried the suggestion of footsteps. And then, just as I started to drift into shallow sleep, my phone buzzed. A single message lit up the screen. Don't ignore me. I felt it like a hand closing around my throat. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the phone, too afraid to breathe. Hours, maybe. Until dawn lit up the skyline and I realized I'd made it through the night. But the relief didn't last, because I understood something now, something that rooted deeper into me than fear itself. He wasn't going to stop. I kept telling myself that nothing was truly happening, that it was only a collection of coincidences and my exhausted imagination weaving them together into something sinister, and yet every hour of every day I felt the weight of his presence pressing against the edges of my life, as if there were hands pressed against the glass of my apartment, invisible but undeniable, smudging fingerprints across my routines. When I left for work in the morning, I would linger at the door, trying to memorize the exact placement of my belongings, the angle of a chair, the fold of the blanket on the couch, and when I returned in the evening, I would hold my breath as I unlocked the door, eyes sweeping the room for the slightest change, and almost every time I found one, a coffee mug moved to the counter when I knew I had left it in the sink. A book nudged a few inches down the shelf. The blinds opened a fraction wider than I had left them. None of it was proof, not in the kind of way you could bring to a landlord or a police officer. But in my gut, I knew these weren't accidents. They weren't mistakes of memory. They were messages written in the arrangement of my own possessions, a language made out of familiarity distorted just enough to remind me I was not alone. The messages from the visitor grew more frequent, and though they were still short, still deceptively simple, there was a cadence to them that made them feel like breaths against the back of my neck. He never wrote more than a sentence, but every sentence seemed carefully chosen to land in the center of my chest and expand outward, filling me with dread. Red wine tonight. Don't leave your window open. I like your laugh. It was the last one that broke something in me. Because I had laughed once that evening, just once, at a stupid video clip my coworker had sent me. I hadn't spoken aloud, hadn't shared it with anyone, hadn't even posted about it, but alone in my living room with the curtains drawn, I had let out a single surprised laugh, quick and unguarded, and within minutes he had acknowledged it. That was when I began to wonder if the phone itself had become the intruder, if the camera lens staring up at me from the coffee table was no longer mine but his, a glass eye transmitting every detail of my life to someone who had decided I belonged to him. I taped over the lens, I turned off the microphone, I scoured the settings, but even after doing all of that, I couldn't shake the sense that the device pulsed with his attention, as if he had rooted himself somewhere deeper than the settings allowed me to reach. I started taking long walks after work just to avoid going home, circling blocks I had no reason to circle, ducking into coffee shops I didn't care to sit in, buying magazines I didn't want, because the longer I delayed returning to the apartment, the longer I could pretend I still had control. But eventually the city grew quieter. The light drained out of the sky, and the only place left to go was back to the high-rise that no longer felt like mine. One night, as I stood outside the building, looking up at the grid of windows glowing softly against the darkness, I caught a movement in one of them, my window, the living room on the 12th floor, and for a fraction of a second, I saw what looked like a silhouette shift past the curtains. My breath hitched, my legs went weak, and I clung to the idea that it had been a reflection, a trick of light, because if it wasn't, then it meant that he was already inside, waiting for me to step through the door. Still, I went up. I don't know if it was bravery or foolishness, but I went up. Inside, everything was as I had left it, and that almost made it worse, because the memory of that silhouette lingered in my mind and made the order of the room feel like camouflage, as if the stillness was not reassurance but a cover for something crouched and patient. I tried to hold on to logic, I really did. I tried to remind myself that technology can be invasive, that apps can scrape data, that coincidences happen, but logic began to thin out like mist, and fear took its place. When the next message came, check under the sink, I didn't want to obey, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of guiding me, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened the cabinet under the sink. There, balanced on the pipe, was a single folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I reached for it. The paper was blank on one side, but when I flipped it over, 3 words had been scrawled in messy black ink. Not good enough. Ow! I dropped it like it burned, my pulse roaring so loud in my ears that I couldn't hear the city outside, couldn't hear anything but the thundering of my own blood. The phrase looped through me, meaningless and yet devastating, because what did it mean? Not good enough. Not good enough for what? For whom? For survival? I wanted to scream, to run out into the hallway and pound on my neighbors' doors, to beg someone else to confirm that this was happening. But I didn't, because some part of me still clung to the illusion that I could handle it privately, that if I just kept calm and rational it would pass. But that illusion shattered a few nights later. I was in bed, tossing, unable to sleep, when I heard a sound, a slow, deliberate knock against the glass of my bedroom window. 12 stories up, no balcony, no ledge, nothing but air outside, and yet the knock came again, steady and patient, as if someone stood there waiting for me to draw back the curtain. I couldn't move. I lay frozen, staring at the dark fabric, waiting for the sound to stop. But instead it grew into a rhythm, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause like a signal, like a heartbeat. Finally, I found the strength to whisper, "Go away," my voice shaking in the dark. And then my phone buzzed. "I'm already here." The words bloomed on the screen like poison, and the air in the room grew so heavy I could barely draw a breath. I wanted to scream, but what came out instead was a whimper, small and broken, and I realized that whatever control I thought I had left was gone. That was the night I understood the rules had changed. This wasn't just an app, wasn't just a person hiding behind a profile. This was something that had stepped across the threshold of my life, and now there was no locking the door, no taping over the camera, no deleting the program. I was no longer the one watching the screen. The screen was watching me. I tried to anchor myself in the rhythms of the outside world, believing that if I surrounded myself with the ordinary noise of the city conversations in coffee shops, the shrill ring of the office phones, the banal chatter about weekend plans, it might drown out the static that followed me everywhere. At work, the open floor of my company's marketing firm felt brighter than usual, almost aggressively so, as if the fluorescent lights were determined to bleach away the shadows clinging to me. My coworkers leaned against their cubicle walls, trading jokes and gossip, and I laughed when I was supposed to laugh, nodded when I was supposed to nod, but inside my head I replayed every message I had received from him. When my phone buzzed at my desk that morning, I almost jumped out of my chair. It was only a group chat from colleagues sharing a meme, but the tiny tremor in my hands betrayed me. I turned the phone over, face down on the desk, but even then I felt it humming against my palm like a heartbeat I couldn't silence. During lunch, I met my coworker Leah at the cafe across the street, trying desperately to cling to the comfort of routine. She was halfway through a story about her disastrous date the night before when I realized I hadn't been listening. Instead, my eyes kept darting to the large window behind her, where people streamed past on the sidewalk, each face a blur, yet each blur a possibility. Leah noticed my distraction. "You okay? You look like you haven't slept." I forced a smile, stirring my coffee, though I hadn't added sugar. Yeah, just long nights. Too much work. Her brow furrowed. You should delete those dating apps. Honestly, they're toxic. You never know who's on the other side. The words hit me like a slap. I hadn't told her about Find Friend, hadn't mentioned anything, and yet her casual warning lodged in me like an omen. When I walked back to the office after lunch, I could feel it, that prickling between my shoulder blades, the sense of someone keeping pace just far enough behind me. I turned once, twice, 3 times, scanning the faces in the crowd. No one stood out. Everyone looked like they belonged to the city, tired men in suits, women in athleisure carrying smoothies, a courier balancing packages. Normal, forgettable. And yet, in that fog of anonymity, the idea of him lurked in every silhouette. That evening, I tried to reclaim some measure of control. I left my phone on the kitchen counter and stepped out to meet an old friend for dinner. The restaurant was loud, clattering with silverware and bursts of laughter, and for the first time in weeks I felt a sliver of reprieve, like maybe the noise itself could keep him out. But when I returned home, stomach full and head heavy with wine, I saw it immediately. My phone wasn't where I had left it. Instead, it rested neatly on the arm of the couch, screen facing up, waiting for me. A new message glowed on the lock screen. Good wine tonight. My throat closed, bile rising. Because yes, I had ordered wine, and yes, I had enjoyed it, but I hadn't texted anyone, hadn't posted a single photo. The illusion cracked again, wider this time. I tried God, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a guess, maybe coincidence, maybe an algorithm pulling data from my receipts. But reason was starting to feel like a flimsy umbrella in a hurricane. In the days that followed, I noticed something subtler, crueler. The messages stopped for stretches of time, sometimes an entire day. And in that silence, I would begin to hope it was over. But always, without fail, when I let my guard down, when I hummed to myself in the shower, when I curled on the couch with a book, when I exhaled deeply into the illusion of safety, that was when the phone buzzed. I like that song. Chapter 3's a good one. Breathe slower. It was as if the visitor had learned the rhythm of my life and was timing his presence to the beat of my most private moments. I stopped laughing. I stopped humming. I tried not to speak aloud when I was alone, but still he found me. And then came the night that folded all of this, the city, the work, the futile distractions into one undeniable truth. That was the night I heard the knock on the window 12 stories above the ground, the rhythm like a heartbeat, the message blooming across my phone. I'm already here. I don't remember how long I sat in the dark after that message, clutching the phone to my chest as though holding it close could keep the words from being true, as though the warmth of my own body might erase the chilling certainty that seeped from the glow of the screen. And yet the hours did pass. The city dimmed further outside my window, and still I remained there, caught between wanting to flee and knowing there was nowhere left to go. When morning finally broke, it felt less like the arrival of safety and more like the intrusion of light on a wound that had not finished bleeding. I rose mechanically, went through the motions of showering, brushing my teeth, dressing for work, but all the while my thoughts circled the same impossible loop. Delete the app, throw the phone away, cut the cord that tethered me to him. So I did. I deleted Find Friend. I pressed down on the icon until it shivered and vanished, and I told myself it was done, that I was free, that there was nothing left to bind me. The silence that followed was heavy but not unbearable, and for a few hours that day, as I moved through meetings and emails, I dared to imagine I had reclaimed some portion of myself. But when I returned home that night, the phone was waiting for me on the counter, screen alight, and the icon was back, its friendly green outline as innocuous as ever, as though it had never left. My chest constricted. I had no memory of reinstalling it. With trembling hands, I opened the phone storage, combed through the settings, but there was nothing. No record of a download, no log of permissions granted, only the smiling interface of Find Friend opening of its own accord. And there, at the top of the screen, was the same friend request pending, still waiting, still patient, still bearing the name that by now haunted me even in sleep. The visitor. I tried to call support, but every number I dialed either dropped into silence or twisted into static before disconnecting. I emailed the developer address listed on the App Store page, but the message bounced back undeliverable. It was as though the app had no creator, no source. no one to hold accountable. Desperation drove me to the building's management office. I told them I was receiving threatening messages, that someone might have access to my apartment. They nodded politely, filed a report, promised to check the locks, but I saw the disbelief in their eyes. They had heard too many tenants spin stories of paranoia and sleeplessness. Too many urban legends whispered across the sterile hallways of the tower. When I insisted on seeing the security footage from my floor, they said it was unavailable, corrupted for the past 2 weeks. Their voices were apologetic but empty, and I realized in that moment how alone I truly was. Back in my apartment, I tried again to exert control. I bought a cheap burner phone, intending to abandon the old one, but within hours of powering it on, a notification bloomed across the new screen. Find friend welcomes you. No installation required. No input from me. The app had simply appeared, as if it had been waiting beneath the surface. That night I lay awake in bed, the phone face down on the nightstand, and I swore I would not look at it, would not answer whatever demand he made of me. But the silence became unbearable, each minute stretching taut until I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. And when at last the vibration came, rattling against the wood like a heartbeat outside my body, I reached for it in spite of myself. The message was different this time. Longer. Look where I keep them. There was no attachment, no link, only the instruction. And with dread, I scrolled through the app's menus until I found something I had never noticed before, a hidden section beneath the friend requests, labeled simply Profiles. The list was long. Each entry bore a name and a photograph, smiling faces frozen in the kind of casual snapshots you'd expect from social media. And beneath each name was a single word: missing. I scrolled until my hand shook too violently to continue. Each face, another life absorbed into this impossible archive. Each name a whisper of someone who had vanished from the world above. And though I told myself it had to be fake, a cruel fabrication, I couldn't silence the memory of news articles I'd skimmed. Headlines about disappearances scattered across the city, people who had gone out for groceries or late-night walks and never returned. When I closed the app, I found that my phone's photo gallery had changed. Nestled among the images of friends and vacations were new pictures, unfamiliar until I looked closer, grainy stills of the very faces I had just seen in the profiles. And mixed among them were pictures of me, sitting at my desk at work, walking home at dusk, standing in my kitchen pouring wine. None of them were photos I had taken. I smashed the phone against the counter until the screen cracked, but even with the glass splintered and bleeding light across my palm, the app still pulsed open, the list of names still glowing. I don't remember lying down. I don't remember sleep claiming me. All I remember is waking to find a new document on my laptop, a file I had never created, sitting alone on the desktop. Its name was simple: Visitor, Log. With shaking fingers, I opened it. Page after page of names, dates, and brief notes, each line describing a person in the moment they were taken. Some notes were banal. She left her window open. He ignored the knock, while others were so intimate they made my skin crawl. And near the end, I saw the entry for a woman named Mallory, who had lived in my very building, on the 10th floor, 2 years prior. The final line of her entry read, "She stopped laughing." I scrolled further, my breath shallow, until I found the most recent page. There was no photograph attached yet, no date filled in, only a blank space waiting to be completed. And above it, typed neatly in black letters, was my own name. I slammed the laptop shut, but the image of those letters had already seared itself into me, burning behind my eyes. There was no denying it anymore. I wasn't just being watched, wasn't just being stalked. I had already been cataloged, claimed, entered into the ledger of the missing. I was no longer a person in my own story. I was a record waiting to be completed. I told myself I would not open the file again, would not let those words stain me further. But denial is a fragile shield, and within days I was back at the screen, scrolling through the endless list of the lost, each name another echo of myself. I no longer knew which hours belonged to me and which had been stolen, because every reflection, every faint sound from the hallway, felt threaded with his presence. I tried to fight it, in the only ways I could imagine. I left the apartment, packed a small bag, fled into the noise of the city. I stayed with a friend across town, a woman who laughed easily and asked few questions, but even there the shadows gathered. On the second night, As we drank tea on her balcony, her phone buzzed against the table, and when she picked it up, her brow furrowed. "Do you know someone called the visitor?" she asked. My stomach turned to ice. She showed me the screen. The app was there too, a green icon tucked between her banking app and her calendar, installed without her knowledge. The request pulsed at the top. "The visitor wants to find you." I begged her not to accept it, begged her to delete it, but she only laughed, said it was some kind of prank, said I was overreacting. That night I didn't sleep, because each time her phone lit up I caught the faint reflection of a figure in the glass, standing just beyond her shoulder. I left before dawn, afraid that my presence alone had infected her, afraid that whatever hunted me was spreading outward like a contagion. I walked until my feet blistered, sat in train stations and coffee shops, pretending to be another weary commuter, but the app was always with me, waiting on every borrowed Wi-Fi signal, glowing on every screen I touched. Once, in the underground concourse of the station, I caught sight of an advertisement screen flickering between posters. For a moment the colors drained, the image warped, and there it was, my own photograph, grainy, eyes wide and frightened. Beneath it, in stark letters, "Missing." I blinked, and the poster snapped back to a perfume ad, all smiles and brightness, but the crowd around me had already shifted, some looking at me with subtle suspicion, as though they had glimpsed it too. I fled back to the apartment I had once called home, though it felt more like a cell now, a place already written into the script of my vanishing. I tried to barricade the door, piled chairs and books against it, but the knocking came anyway, soft and measured, echoing through the glass balcony doors, through the vents, through the very walls. Sometimes it was accompanied by words, whispered in a voice that was neither male nor female, young nor old, but something stretched thin and impossible. "You're already here. Let me in." Sleep deserted me. Food turned to ash in my mouth. My world narrowed to the glow of screens, the weight of silence, and the constant knowledge that I was no longer living in my own timeline. I was an annotation in his archive, a footnote awaiting completion. One evening, desperate, I tried to erase myself from the digital world entirely. I deleted every account, burned old drives, smashed SIM cards into dust. But the moment I powered on the laptop again, the file opened of its own accord, filling the screen with scrolling lines of text. New entries wrote themselves before my eyes. The date, the time, the description of my movements even as I sat there, breath held, watching my life reduced to data. And then I saw it, my entry, expanding, completing itself. She returned home. She tried to hide. She writes these words as though they will outlive her. She will hear the final knock soon. I slammed the lid shut, but the words were already etched inside me. Now, as I speak into this recorder, as my voice threads out across whatever signal still carries it, I understand that this confession is not protection, not a shield, but perhaps the only trace I can leave behind when the ledger closes over my name. The apartment is dark except for the pulsing glow of the app. The knock has begun again, steady and patient, like a second heartbeat pressing against the walls. I know I cannot ignore it much longer. If you are listening, if my voice reaches you across the static, know this: do not look for me. Do not search your phone. Do not open the requests waiting in the background. Do not whisper the name he carries, because once you do, he will find you too. And when he does, you will discover that your name was already written, long before you ever thought to wonder who was knocking at your door. Story 5. The Rumor of the 13th Floor. I suppose I should start by telling you who I am, although by now that feels less important than the things I have seen and the silence that follows me when I try to sleep. My name is David Mercer. I am 27 years old, and for the past 5 years I have worked as a maintenance engineer specializing in vertical transport systems, elevators, lifts, the quiet steel stomachs of buildings that carry people between floors without them ever thinking about the machinery that makes it possible. Most people never notice the work that goes into making elevators safe, or how old many of them really are. But I have spent enough time in dusty shafts and service rooms to understand that every elevator has its own temperament, its own history, and sometimes its own secrets. The job came to me in a way I did not question much at the time. A regional facilities contractor phoned one Tuesday afternoon and asked if I could take on a private contract in the city. The building was a hotel, the Halcyon Grand, an old high-rise that had been standing since the late 1920s. The client wanted a complete inspection of the elevator system before a round of renovations. I did not think twice. Work had been scarce that month, and hotels, especially old ones, usually paid well for thorough reports. I signed the papers, packed my toolkit, and drove downtown the following morning, not knowing then that this assignment would mark the beginning of nights I have not yet escaped. You have to understand the feeling of approaching the Halcyon Grand. It rises from the street like a slab of shadow, its stone facade soot-stained and weathered by decades of rain, its windows dark even in daylight. The marquee lights above the entrance still glimmer, though half of them are burnt out, so the words Halcyon Grand look broken, as though the building itself is stuttering when it tries to remember its name. A revolving door of polished brass leads you inside, and immediately you are swallowed by a lobby that feels too large for the modern world. Marble floors stretch into distance, their surfaces dulled by thousands of footsteps. Chandeliers hang heavy with dust, their crystals dimmed to amber by time. There is a smell there, the kind of smell old buildings exhale when they have held too many seasons, something like damp plaster, floor wax, and a hint of mildew hiding under perfume. The concierge who greeted me was polite but strangely reluctant, as though the presence of a maintenance engineer disturbed the delicate balance of the lobby's silence. He guided me to the service desk, handed me a ring of keys, and told me I would find the control room behind a door near the elevators. He did not ask my name again. He did not smile. His eyes lingered on me with an expression I could not place. Not quite suspicion, not quite pity, but something else. There were 4 elevators in the main bank, their brass doors tarnished, the Art Deco motif still elegant but faded. When I ran my palm across one of the call buttons, I felt the chill of metal that has not been touched enough. These were machines from another era, built solid, built proud, and like all old things, prone to hiding quirks. The control room was a narrow chamber behind the shaft wall, filled with panels of switches, breakers, and wiring diagrams laminated under glass. I pulled out the old schematics, preparing to cross-check them with the current system, and that is when I noticed something strange. The floor register listed basements, ground, mezzanine, levels 1 through 12, then skipping discreetly 14, 15, and upward, just as one would expect, because most hotels, especially old ones in America, avoid labeling a floor 13. It is a superstition woven deep into architecture, the fear that guests would refuse to stay on such a floor, that bad luck would cling to the walls. But then I powered on the diagnostic interface. The monitor, grainy and humming faintly, scrolled through the system logs, and there, nestled between the 12th and 14th floors, was an entry, 13. At first I assumed it was an error, some miscoding in the software, a leftover from an earlier build. Yet the data repeated, consistent, undeniable. The system believed in a 13th floor. I leaned back in the chair, uneasy laughter in my throat. The building should not have it. The plans did not show it. No guest could ever select it. And yet, in the skeleton of wiring and programming, the 13th floor waited, acknowledged like a phantom limb. When I mentioned this later to the concierge, in passing, he grew stiff, his jaw locking as though I had spoken something indecent. He said, "There is no 13th floor, sir. Perhaps the computer is confused." Then he excused himself and hurried away before I could press further. The days that followed became a rhythm of mechanical checks, cables, brakes, counterweights, door alignment. Yet I found myself returning again and again to the control panel, watching the logs. Sometimes, late at night, when the hotel was quieter, I would see entries that unsettled me more deeply. A car registered as having paused on floor 13 for several seconds before resuming, or doors reported as opening and closing with no corresponding call button pressed. I would examine the physical elevators afterward, and everything appeared normal, but the records remained. By the 3rd evening, I was dreaming of it. I would wake in the dark of my apartment, hearing the groan of cables, the whisper of doors parting. I would imagine stepping into the elevator, pressing a button that did not exist, feeling the descent or ascent toward a space that should not be. On Friday, I stayed late at the hotel, telling myself I needed more data for the report. The lobby emptied of tourists. The chandeliers dimmed. The concierge retired to his office. I lingered in the elevator car, toolkit beside me, watching the lights climb. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Then there was a pause, a quiver under my feet. A half-second of hesitation, as though the system were considering whether to continue, and then it leapt, skipping, landing on 14. My breath caught. I knew then that I had felt the shadow of that hidden place, a mechanical hesitation where the impossible had nearly intruded into the real. I did not step off. I pressed the button for the lobby, watched the numbers descend, felt the slight tremor again between 12 and 14. And when the doors opened onto marble and silence, I realized I was gripping the rail so tightly my knuckles ached. That night I returned home, but sleep evaded me. I could still feel the phantom shudder beneath my shoes, as though the elevator's heart had skipped a beat. I told myself it was fatigue, that old systems often hiccup, that the mind fills in what it expects. Yet every rational explanation dissolved under the certainty that there was something more. By the end of the week, I had written little of the official report. Instead, my notes were cluttered with sketches, arrows, questions scribbled in the margins. Why is it listed? Who wrote the code? What happens if I force the command? The Halcyon Grand had begun to feel less like a workplace and more like a puzzle laid deliberately in my path, and I could not resist puzzles. What I did not understand then, what I could not possibly have foreseen, was that puzzles do not always want to be solved. Some exist only to pull you deeper, one question after another, until you are no longer sure which answers belong to you, and which were written for you long before you arrived. And somewhere above the 12th floor, or perhaps below it, behind those gilded brass doors, the silence of the 13th floor was waiting, patient as gravity. I promised myself I would not become obsessed, that I would treat the log entries as technical glitches and finish my report as required. But obsession does not arrive all at once. It seeps, drip by drip, until the shape of your thoughts belongs to something other than you. By Monday morning, I found myself walking back into the Halcyon Grand with a determination I tried to disguise as professionalism, though deep down I knew I was already hunting for something I could not define. The elevators looked the same, still polished brass dulled with fingerprints, still humming faintly as they carried guests to and fro, but I could no longer step into them without waiting for that telltale pause between 12 and 14. Each ride was an experiment now, each tremor another piece of evidence. I brought diagnostic equipment, portable meters, a laptop connected to the control interface, and began logging every fluctuation. For the first few rides, nothing dramatic occurred, only that subtle hesitation, the almost imperceptible catch of machinery as though the system remembered something it was not supposed to. But then, late that afternoon, I noticed the floor indicator panel flicker. We were rising past 11 when the glow of 12 stuttered, broke apart, and for a fraction of a second the number 13 appeared, glowing red, before skipping forward to 14. My stomach turned. The passenger beside me, a middle-aged man in a business suit, did not react, did not seem to notice, as though the apparition of the number had been for me alone. I gripped the rail, pulse loud in my ears, and tried to convince myself it was a trick of failing circuitry. That evening I confronted the building manager, a tall man named Hollis with thinning hair and a face like carved wax. I laid out my findings, the log entries, the flicker of the indicator, the hesitation of the lift. I expected curiosity, perhaps concern, but instead his expression hardened, and his voice dropped until it was barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "your task is to ensure these elevators are operational and safe. Write your report. Submit it. Leave the rest alone." His tone brooked no argument, yet I felt argument rising in me anyway. The need to push. "But the system recognizes a 13th floor," I insisted. "Someone programmed it that way. There must be a reason." There is no 13th floor," he repeated flatly, and then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the lobby with the taste of unanswered questions thick on my tongue. That night I stayed later than I should have. The hotel corridors are strange after midnight, when most guests are behind closed doors and the silence settles into the carpets. The chandeliers cast more shadow than light, and the air feels heavy, as though it has been exhaled too many times. I wandered the service hallways behind the elevator shafts, listening to the machinery groan and sigh, and once I thought I heard footsteps echoing above me, pacing back and forth across a floor that should not exist. The following day I tried something reckless. I connected directly to the elevator control panel, overriding the default commands. My fingers hesitated above the keys, then typed the number 13. The system responded with a low mechanical hum. The car jolted, lights flickered, and for a moment I felt the entire structure tremble around me as though straining against its own bones. Then the screen flashed invalid destination, and the lift returned obediently to the lobby, doors parting as if nothing had happened. But in the log file, the command had registered. For exactly 6 seconds, the car had been recorded as en route to floor 13 before aborting. 6 seconds that did not belong anywhere on the blueprints. I began riding the elevators at odd hours, alone when I could manage it, pressing my hand to the walls, listening for hidden vibrations. Once, between 12 and 14, I thought I felt the faintest deceleration, as though the car had brushed against a landing. My ears popped with a pressure shift that left me dizzy. The panel glowed 12, 13, 14, but only for the blink of an eye, so quick I could not swear it was real. By now, sleep was coming in fragments, and when I did drift off, I dreamed of doors opening onto hallways without end, carpets worn thin by footsteps I could not hear. I woke with the taste of dust in my mouth, as though I had been breathing old air. The staff began to avoid me. The concierge, who once nodded politely, now looked away when I passed. Housekeepers wheeled their carts quickly down side corridors rather than share an elevator with me. Even the guests seemed to sense something, glancing curiously at my tools, my strained expression, before retreating into their rooms. One evening, alone in the lobby, I overheard 2 bellboys whispering near the service desk. "Did he ask about it yet?" one murmured. "He will. They all do," said the other, voice low, almost trembling. "Then what?" "Then he stops asking." They noticed me then and fell silent, eyes darting away, but their words lodged in my mind like splinters. By the end of that week, I could no longer deny what I had seen. The system recognized a 13th floor. The car sometimes lingered there, invisible to anyone but me. And when the panel flickered, showing that forbidden number, I felt a tug in my chest like gravity itself was trying to persuade me. I should have walked away. I should have written my report, collected my pay, and forgotten the Halcyon Grand. But the lure of that hidden floor, the question of what could possibly be waiting behind those unmarked doors, had already taken root. And once you have seen the number glow where no number should be, you cannot unsee it. I told myself I was still in control, that what I was doing was nothing more than engineering diligence. But there comes a moment when diligence crosses into something darker, and for me that moment was the night I returned to the Halcyon Grand long after I had any business being there. The hour when the lobby is emptied of its polite bustle and the carpets lie still, drinking up the last traces of footsteps, when even the reception desk seems half abandoned, the clerks whispering among themselves as though they too would rather not acknowledge the building after midnight. I walked slowly across the lobby tiles, trying to look casual, though every sound I made seemed too loud, the roll of my case against the floor, the creak of my shoes, and it struck me that silence is never truly empty in a place like this. It carries weight, it presses against you, and the more you listen, the more you realize how thick it has become. The elevators gleamed in their brass frames, 4 doors in a row like sealed vaults. I chose the leftmost, the one that had flickered before, and stepped inside, the faint smell of oil and ozone clinging to the air, the kind of mechanical perfume that never leaves machinery. I pressed 12, then quickly reached for the maintenance key I had been given and overrode the panel. My fingers hovered, then typed the forbidden digits. 1, 3. At first, nothing. A long whir, a rumble deep in the shaft, the sensation of rising. The numbers lit dutifully. 9, 10, 11, 12. Then came the hesitation, that strange mechanical stutter, and for a breathless instant the panel glowed red. 13. The car slowed. I felt my stomach dip as if the lift had brushed against a landing. My ears rang like pressure changing inside a cabin. The doors shivered, as though they wanted to part but were held closed by some invisible restraint. In that half-second pause, I swore I felt the draft of air slipping through, colder than the rest of the building, carrying a smell that did not belong in a polished hotel, something stale, metallic, almost like dust that had been locked away too long. And then, without a sound, the panel jumped to 14. The doors opened to a hallway bright with patterned carpet, and a couple stepped in, smiling, oblivious, nodding politely while my pulse thundered in my ears. I did not speak. I could not. Later, alone in my room, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the circuitry, an echo in the system, a mechanical hiccup exaggerated by my expectations. But the memory of that cold draft haunted me. There is no draft inside an elevator unless a door opens. The next day, I prowled the hotel corridors, looking for anything that might prove the floor existed physically, searching stairwells, counting the landings. 12, 14, no 13. Yet the flights of stairs did not align the way they should have. There was an extra stretch, a longer climb between those numbers than any other, as though the architecture had been stretched to conceal something. I stopped in the 13th landing, no number on the wall, only a blank stretch of painted plaster, and pressed my ear against it. Faintly, very faintly, I thought I heard something moving on the other side, a shuffling, measured, almost like someone walking slowly back and forth. When a housekeeper found me there, crouched by the wall, she froze, and for a long time neither of us spoke. Then she shook her head quickly, muttered, "No, es para usted, not for you," and hurried away without another glance. That evening I returned to the elevators again, determined this time to catch the moment fully, to see what lay beyond. I waited until the lobby thinned out, until the concierge yawned behind his desk, and then I slipped inside the leftmost car once more, heart pounding, palms slick. The ride was smooth, too smooth, as though anticipating me. The panel lit each floor in steady rhythm until it reached 12, and then the pause lengthened, not half a second this time, but a full breath, and the glow of 13 burned steady, crimson against the brass. The car stopped. The doors shuddered, and slowly, reluctantly, began to part. Beyond them was not the patterned carpet of 14, nor the friendly brightness of any other floor. Instead, I glimpsed a hallway drenched in shadow, lit only by a faint red glow from fixtures I did not recognize. The air that drifted in was icy, carrying that metallic tang once more, and in the far distance I thought I saw movement. A figure, just the suggestion of someone turning away, vanishing around a corner that should not exist. Then, with a violent jolt, the doors slammed shut, the panel blinked to 14, and I was left gasping as the car carried me upward, my knees weak, my throat dry. When the doors opened, the hallway looked perfectly ordinary, the same as always. But I stumbled out anyway, desperate for air. I had seen it, not imagined, not dreamed. The 13th floor was there, waiting, and someone or something was walking its corridors. I had stopped sleeping properly by then, drifting in and out of shallow dreams that always ended with the same sensation. The metallic chill of air seeping in through half-open doors, the whisper of unseen corridors pressing against my mind, and every time I woke I found myself staring at the ceiling as though the plaster would peel away and reveal that hidden floor above me. During the day I tried to hold on to reason, moving through the hotel with my clipboard in hand, pretending to check fixtures, outlets, load reports, but I could feel the way the staff watched me, the way conversations dropped into silence when I entered, the quick glances traded over my shoulder. It wasn't just suspicion, it was fear. Fear of what I was chasing, or fear of what might be listening while I asked my questions. The concierge, a man who had smiled at me daily in the first week, now avoided my gaze, turning to shuffle papers whenever I passed. And once, when I asked casually about discrepancies in the blueprints, he pressed his lips together so tightly the skin went pale, shook his head, and whispered, "There is no 13th floor, sir," before hurrying away as though he had spoken too much. I told myself I was imagining it, paranoia fed by sleeplessness. But when even the housekeeping cart seemed to vanish as I walked the corridors, when the walls seemed to stretch too long between floors, when every elevator chime felt like a warning, I knew it was not simply my mind unraveling. It was the building itself urging me to step where I should not. So one night I made the decision. No more hesitation. No more catching glimpses through a crack. No more being thrown back into safety. If the elevator wanted to show me its hidden passage, I would not let it close again. I prepared like a man going into exile. I carried a flashlight, a small crowbar tucked into my bag, tools to wedge the doors if the system tried to shut me out. My hands trembled as I fitted the maintenance key into the slot, as though the metal itself was reluctant to turn. But it did, and the panel lit up obediently. He wrote in silence. Numbers climbed. Ni, ti, eleve, 12. Then came the pause, longer than before, the sound of the motor straining as though caught between realities. And then, with a slow inevitability, the digits glowed. 13. The car shuddered to a halt. This time the doors began to part smoothly. No violent jolt, no last-second rescue, only a patient surrender. And I moved quickly, wedging the crowbar into the seam, forcing them wide until the opening was large enough for me to step through. The air that struck me was not just cold but heavy, pressing against my skin, carrying a dry bitterness that tasted of dust and iron, and I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to, as though my lungs themselves knew better than to inhale deeply. The hallway stretched ahead, carpet faded to a dull red, patterns warped like water stains, the light fixtures dim and buzzing with a frequency that made my skull ache. The architecture was familiar yet wrong, proportions just slightly distorted, doors too tall, ceilings too low in places, as if the floor had been built by someone who had studied hotels without ever staying in one. I took a step forward, my shoes sinking into the worn fabric, and the elevator behind me groaned as if protesting, the doors shivering against the crowbar but unable to close. I had crossed the threshold. Silence ruled the corridor, but it was not an empty silence, it was a listening silence, the kind that waits for you to speak first. And I felt the hair rise on my arms as I realized how loud my own heartbeat had become. Halfway down the hallway, one of the doors stood slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness leaked from the gap, deeper than shadow, almost inviting. I told myself not to, that I had come far enough, but my feet carried me closer, drawn as though the floor itself wanted me to enter. And just as I reached it, the sound came soft, deliberate, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps pacing behind the door, back and forth, pausing as though they too were listening to me. I froze, every muscle screaming, and in that frozen silence I understood the truth. I was not alone here. I had never been alone here. I do not know what compelled me to push further down that corridor, whether it was curiosity or resignation or something that had been pulling me since the first night I touched the controls of the elevator. But the truth is that by then, I had already surrendered. I had already given myself to the floor, and every step I took felt less like an act of will and more like an acknowledgement of something written long before I arrived. The pacing behind the half-open door ceased the moment I lingered before it, silence swelling with the weight of an unfinished sentence. And though every instinct urged me to turn back, to wrench open the elevator and flee, I found myself brushing my fingertips against the warped brass knob, cold as ice, slick with a condensation that had no place inside a sealed building. And when I pushed the door inward, the hinges did not squeal but sighed, like something long asleep disturbed from a dream. The room beyond was not a hotel suite, not even a room at all in the sense I expected, but an unfinished hollow of concrete and steel, skeletal beams arching above like the ribs of some buried creature, and in the center stood a single desk, battered, municipal, lit by a lamp that gave no true light yet illuminated everything cruelly, and on the desk lay a ledger, its pages yellowed and curled, ink bleeding across the lines like veins. I approached slowly, the air thickening with each step, the silence so absolute I could hear the click of my saliva as I swallowed. The ledger was open. My eyes scanned the names scrawled across its surface, each one followed by a date, and then nothing. No notes, no signatures, just a void where explanation should have been. Some names I did not know, others I vaguely recalled from muttered stories overheard in town, men who had disappeared, workers who had supposedly moved away, guests who had never checked out. The last name I recognized with a jolt, Mallory. There was no date beside hers, just a line drawn downward, trailing like a crack in the page. My breath caught. My chest felt hollow. And then, beneath that fracture, I saw the final entry written in careful black strokes, so fresh the ink still shone wet under the lamplight. David Mercer. I stared at it until the letters blurred, my mind revolting, rejecting, and yet unable to deny the shape of the words. And as I stood there, a sound rose in the walls. Faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of an elevator descending, cables singing, pulleys grinding, approaching floor by floor, each chime echoing down the hallway like a funeral bell. I turned toward the doorway, heart lurching, but the corridor outside no longer looked as it had. The perspective warped, stretching endlessly into gloom, the carpet rotted, the lights flickering, and from that distance figures began to emerge. Slow, deliberate, pale silhouettes walking in silence, their faces blurred, their clothes out of time, moving as one toward me. The elevator behind me groaned open, but when I spun back, it was not the polished car I had entered, but a gutted shell. Walls stripped, wires dangling, the shaft yawning black beyond. Still, the doors waited, open, patient, as if offering me the only exit I would ever have. I stumbled toward it, the ledger clutched without memory of taking it, the ink burning through my fingertips. But as I crossed the threshold, the air collapsed around me. The doors shuddered, and a voice not heard but pressed directly into my skull spoke with terrible clarity. "You have always belonged here." The doors slammed. Darkness swallowed me. And now, as I speak these words, I know the elevator never stopped moving, the numbers climbing past anything the building should contain, the hum stretching into eternity, and though I cannot see the floor beneath me, I can feel it waiting. The 13th floor, patient and endless, a place with no exit, and I understand at last that the true trap was not the building at all, but the certainty that once you have seen the door, you will always step through it. Story 6. The Haunted Painting. I suppose I should begin with a confession, the kind of thing you only whisper to yourself in the early hours when the city outside has gone quiet, when the world seems almost merciful in its silence. I was lonely, so desperately lonely that even I could taste it in the air of my apartment, the metallic tang of stillness that never left, no matter how many times I cracked a window or lit candles or played music low on my speakers. I was a student at the time, a young woman living alone in a high-rise block in the city, studying art with the kind of reckless devotion that kept me awake past midnight, painting until my fingers cramped, sketching until the graphite turned my skin gray. People talk about art school as though it's a burst of color and community, a vibrant place where creativity flows like wine. But my experience was quieter, harsher, lonelier. Yes, I was surrounded by students, but I never felt part of them. They moved like schools of fish, laughing, gathering in their groups, and I hovered on the edges, painting shadows, sketching details no one else seemed to notice. When you are quiet in a world that rewards loudness, you become invisible, and after a while, invisibility becomes a kind of curse. It was around that time I began haunting thrift shops and antique stores, telling myself I was hunting for inspiration. The truth is, I liked the weight of old things. They carried history in their silence, and if you listened closely enough, you could almost hear the echo of the hands that had held them before. A chipped teacup might hum with the memory of dinners long gone. A cracked mirror might still hold the last reflection of someone who once stood before it. I like to think that by surrounding myself with these forgotten objects, I was less alone. One rainy afternoon, I remember the light, gray and dim, the kind of light that paints the streets in silver streaks. I wandered into a shop I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered bookstore, its window so dust-streaked I almost passed it by. Inside it smelled of wood rot and varnish, and the air seemed thicker, as though the place itself was holding its breath. The shopkeeper was nowhere in sight. I moved slowly between the shelves, running my fingers across spines of forgotten books, cracked porcelain dolls, tarnished frames, and then I saw it. The painting. It leaned against the wall in the corner, not hung, not displayed, as though someone had placed it there to be overlooked. At first glance, it was nothing unusual. An old canvas, a simple oil study of a house. The house itself was plain, a weathered two-story farmhouse, its roof sagging slightly, its shutters peeling, set alone in the middle of a pale field with no trees, no neighbors, nothing but emptiness stretching to the horizon. The colors were muted, faded with age, grays and browns that bled into each other. It should have been dull, forgettable, but it wasn't. The moment my eyes fell on it, something tugged at me. Not admiration, this wasn't the kind of painting you admire for its technique, but a compulsion, a quiet insistence that I looked closer. The brush strokes were rough, almost hurried, yet the house seemed to stare back at me, as if the windows themselves were watching. There was no figure in the painting, no human presence at all, but the more I gazed at it, the more I felt I was being observed from inside those dark squares of glass. I don't remember deciding to buy it. I remember only standing at the counter, the shopkeeper finally appearing, her eyes sliding away from mine as she wrapped the canvas in brown paper. I asked her nothing. She said nothing. The exchange was soundless, as if words had no place in the transaction. Carrying it home, I felt foolish, hugging a rain-dampened package to my chest as though it were fragile, as though it were alive. The elevator ride to my apartment seemed longer than usual, the hum of the machinery vibrating through my ribs. When I stepped into my unit, the familiar square of white walls and cheap furniture, I felt suddenly conscious of how bare it all was, how sterile. I tore off the paper and propped the painting against the wall. The farmhouse stared back at me. I told myself I would leave it there for the night, decide later if I wanted to hang it. But by the time I'd cooked a simple dinner and sat with my sketchbook, I kept glancing toward it, the way you glance at a person sharing a room with you. It changed the atmosphere, in subtle ways. The silence no longer felt oppressive but companionable. The shadows in the corners seemed less heavy. By midnight I had hung it above my desk, the nails sinking easily into the plaster as though the wall had been waiting for it. I sat beneath it, sketching, the farmhouse looming above my head, and for the first time in weeks, I did not feel quite so alone. I slept with my bedroom door open that night, wanting to see it one last time from the hall, its faint outline visible in the glow of the street lamp filtering through my curtains. It was only a painting, I told myself, just an old canvas from a forgotten shop. But even then, even in those first hours, I had the distinct and undeniable sense that I had brought something else home with me. I should have trusted the first shiver that ran through me when I hung that canvas above my desk, the slight tremor of unease that I forced myself to swallow, telling myself it was only the thrill of bringing something new into my space, a shift in the balance of the room. The truth, of course, was that something had already begun to shift, though I didn't want to admit it then. The days after I brought the painting home passed in that blurred way time has when you live alone, where the rhythms of your life are dictated only by your own body, your own small needs. I went to class, I came back, I painted, I ate quickly, I slept badly, and all the while the farmhouse watched over me from its place on the wall. It should have been just another decoration, no more important than the stack of books on my shelves or the chipped mugs by my sink, and yet, in every quiet moment, I felt its weight pressing against the atmosphere of the apartment. At first, the changes were so small I thought I was imagining them. A shadow along the roofline seemed darker than before, as though a cloud had drifted across the painted sky. The pale field surrounding the house, which I remembered as blank, flat brushstrokes of beige and gray, seemed to ripple faintly, as though the suggestion of weeds or stalks had emerged. I told myself it was only my mind filling in details, the way a person can stare at wallpaper and begin to see faces in its swirls. But still, I caught myself staring longer than I meant to, waiting for the moment when it would betray its stillness. At night, the painting became something else entirely. The apartment was never truly dark. Living in the city meant that light always found its way in. The orange glow of a street lamp, the cold gleam of a distant billboard, the flicker of a passing car. Shadows in my rooms were always layered with that strange city light haze. And yet when I looked at the painting, its darkness felt deeper, more absolute, as if the farmhouse existed in some world where no street lamps burned, no neon hummed, no headlights passed. I lay awake sometimes, staring at it from across the room, and the black squares of the window seemed to swell, to throb faintly, as though something inside was moving against the glass. Then came the sounds. At first it was nothing more than a creak now and then, the sort of thing every apartment has: pipes expanding, floors settling. But the timing was wrong. Always the sounds came just as my eyes began to drift closed, just as I let myself believe I could sleep. A soft shuffle, like fabric dragging across wood. A hollow knock, too deliberate to be dismissed. Once, very distinctly, the sound of a sigh, long and tired, as though someone had been holding their breath for too long. I rose from bed more than once, padding barefoot into the living room, whispering to myself that it was the neighbor upstairs, that it was the wind slipping through a vent, that it was nothing, nothing at all. But each time when I stood in the middle of my small apartment, the painting loomed above my desk, and the silence pressed in so heavily that I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. During the day I tried to distract myself. I told friends in class, half joking, that I'd found a creepy old painting from my apartment. They laughed, asked to see pictures, but when I scrolled through my phone I realized I hadn't taken any. For some reason, I hadn't thought to. I snapped one then, quickly, angling my camera up toward the farmhouse. But the photo came out flat, the colors muddied, nothing like what I saw in person. The windows, though, were strange. On my phone screen, they looked smudged, as though something had been wiped hastily across them, blurring the dark shapes. I deleted the photo almost immediately, telling myself it was just bad lighting. The more I tried to ignore it, the more insistent it became. I found myself adjusting my schedule around it, sketching only in the living room, sitting always with my back to the wall so that the farmhouse hovered just over my shoulder. A silent presence I both resented and needed. There was a comfort in it too, and I can't deny that. The silence of my apartment no longer seemed so empty. I began talking to myself aloud more often, sometimes even addressing the painting, laughing at my own absurdity but never quite stopping. One night, after a particularly long day, I came home to find something different. I dropped my bag, turned on the lamp, and froze. The field surrounding the farmhouse was no longer blank. A path had appeared, faint but visible, winding from the edge of the canvas toward the front door of the house. I stood there for a long time, my breath caught high in my chest, my eyes watering because I refused to blink. The path was there. I knew it hadn't been there before. I had studied that canvas for hours. The field had always been empty. Now there was a trail of pale strokes, deliberate, leading straight to the dark square of the doorway. I forced myself closer, inspecting the brushwork. The strokes were crude, rough, as though added quickly, and yet the paint was as cracked and aged as the rest of the canvas. My mind reeled, trying to fit the impossibility into something rational. Maybe I had overlooked it. Maybe my memory was faulty. Maybe I had wanted so badly to find change that I had imagined it. But as I stood there, close enough to smell the faint, musty scent of the old oils, I felt the distinct impression that the house wanted me to notice, that it had revealed this path, not by accident, but by intention. That night I hardly slept. I left every light on in the apartment, the glow bleaching the walls, and still, when I closed my eyes, I saw that pale path leading me forward, step by step, toward the waiting doorway of a house that did not exist in any world I should have access to. By morning I was hollow-eyed, trembling from lack of rest, but I forced myself into routine. I drank too much coffee, dragged myself to class, told no one what I'd seen. And when I returned home, exhausted, my first thought was not food or rest, but to look at the painting. The path was still there, but now it seemed sharper, more defined, as though it had grown clearer in my absence. And for the first time since I had brought the farmhouse into my apartment, I felt the beginnings of true fear, the kind that sits cold in your stomach and whispers that you have already gone too far, that whatever door you have opened will not close again. I used to think that fear was a sudden thing, a sharp spike in the chest, the kind of terror that comes from a scream in the dark or the slam of a door. But that was before the painting. What I learned, what I lived, was that the worst fear is patient, quiet, slow as rot. It waits. It grows in increments so small you hardly notice, until suddenly your entire life has been shaped around it, until every thought bends toward the thing you tried to ignore. That was the way the farmhouse began to consume me. The path had been the first undeniable shift. I told myself that much I could endure, that much I could rationalize. But after that night, it was as though the painting had decided I was ready for more. It no longer hid its changes behind doubt or exhaustion. They came boldly, with each new evening, like the careful turning of a key in a lock, letting me further in. The first time I saw it was late, close to 3 a.m. I'd been sketching at my desk, trying to distract myself with half-hearted drawings that never seemed to come alive. When I felt the weight of the farmhouse pressing at my periphery, I turned, weary, and froze. There, at the end of the pale path, just at the edge of the farmhouse door, was a shadow. It was faint, no more than a darker suggestion of shape, as though someone had spilled ink on the canvas. But it was not an accident of paint. It was vertical, upright, narrow at the top, widening at the shoulders, tapering downward. A figure, standing before the door, facing outward. I stared until my eyes burned. The air in the apartment felt heavy, hard to draw into my lungs, as though the very atmosphere had grown thick with presence. I forced myself closer, whispering, "No, you weren't there before, you weren't there." My voice trembled too loud in the silence. I leaned in until my nose nearly brushed the cracked surface of the canvas. The figure was blurred, indistinct, but it was there. I could see the faint line of what might have been an arm, bent at the side. the suggestion of a head tilted forward. It was too deliberate to be mistaken, too precise to be dismissed as random brushstroke. I stumbled back, my chair scraping across the floor, my knees striking the desk. I switched on every lamp, every overhead light, flooding the room with brightness, but the figure remained. It did not vanish in the glow. It stood there, unmoved, its shadow carved into the canvas as if it had always belonged. That night I did not sleep. The hours dragged. I sat on the couch with the television playing, volume low, my eyes refusing to leave the painting even when I tried. Each time I glanced away, I felt the tightening of my skin, the prickling of the hairs at my nape, the certainty that if I did not keep watch, the figure would move. But it didn't. It only stood, silent, at the threshold of the painted farmhouse waiting. By morning, when the city began to stir with the groan of buses and the clang of trash bins, the figure remained. My head ached from the strain of wakefulness. My stomach churned with too much coffee and too little food. I dressed with hands that shook, went to class, took notes without understanding them. Every moment the farmhouse lingered in my mind, the image seared behind my eyes. When I returned that evening, dread clamped down before I even unlocked the door. I stood in the hallway outside my apartment, listening to the faint hum of other lives, televisions through thin walls, the bark of a dog, the buzz of a microwave. I envied them, all those unseen neighbors, their simple and ordinary nights. When I finally forced the door open, the apartment air hit me like a wall, stale and charged, as though the rooms had been holding their breath in my absence. The farmhouse was waiting. The figure was clearer now. The shadows had sharpened, the brushstrokes more defined. I could see the pale suggestion of hands, long and narrow, hanging at its sides. The head was bowed slightly forward, so that its face, if it had a face, was lost in shadow. It stood with the stillness of a sentinel, unmoving, but there was a tilt to the body, a subtle lean that gave the impression of attention, of focus, as if it had been waiting for me specifically. I tried to tell myself I was hallucinating. Stress, fatigue, some trick of the brain. But even as I whispered these excuses, I knew how thin they were. Nothing in my life had prepared me for this. Nothing in the world of reason could explain it. The farmhouse was changing, alive in some way, and I was its chosen witness. That night the noises grew louder. They no longer hid in the soft sighs of pipes or the gentle creaks of wood. They came deliberate, insistent, a slow shuffle across the floorboards of my living room when I knew no one was there. The distinct knock of something against the desk. Once, terrifyingly, the rattle of my doorknob, as though tested by an unseen hand. I sat rigid on my bed, every light burning, heart pounding in my throat. My phone clutched tight in my hand, though I couldn't bring myself to dial anyone. What would I say? That a painting I bought at a thrift shop was alive? That it was changing? That there was someone inside it? I knew the words would sound ridiculous even as I thought them, and worse, I felt the house inside the canvas did not want me to speak. It was mine now, mine alone, and to share it would be to break some unspoken pact, and beneath it all, threaded through every sound, was the faintest impression that I was not alone in my apartment. It was in the corner of my vision, the twitch of shadow when I turned my head. It was in the way the air shifted, the cool draft across the back of my neck as though someone had exhaled there. It was in the mirror above my sink, where sometimes I thought I caught the outline of another body standing just behind my shoulder, gone the instant I looked directly. The nights bled together. My sleep came only in fragments, half dreaming, half waking states, where I sometimes thought I heard the figure move inside the canvas, the faint scrape of its step along the painted path, though when I forced my eyes open it was always there at the doorway, unmoved, watching. And yet, despite my terror, I found myself drawn to it. I lingered in front of the painting longer each evening, unable to resist. I searched for new details, for subtle changes. It was like watching the slow growth of mold across bread, disgusting but impossible to turn away from. The farmhouse had me. One evening, near midnight, I sat before it in the dim glow of my desk lamp, exhaustion pulling at my limbs, and I whispered aloud, "What do you want?" I didn't expect an answer. Not really. But in the silence that followed, I swear I heard the faintest shift of sound, not from the apartment but from within the canvas itself, the whisper of a floorboard under weight, the long, low creak of a door opening inward. My breath caught, my skin prickled with cold. I stared at the painting, wide-eyed, and in that moment the figure's head seemed to lift, ever so slightly, as though acknowledging me. I stumbled back, knocking the lamp to the floor, plunging the room into shadow. By the time I righted it, the farmhouse was still, unchanged. The figure was bowed once more, but the sense of response lingered, undeniable, and from that moment on I could no longer pretend this was something passive, something accidental. It was aware. It knew me, and it was waiting. I don't remember when the line between canvas and room began to blur, only that once it started, there was no way back. It crept slowly, as everything with the farmhouse did, a whisper here, a suggestion there, until the impossible became ordinary, until I no longer trusted the very air I breathed. The figure had been waiting at the door for nights, unmoving, its bowed head and long arms fixed in that dreadful patience. But then one evening, as I sat hunched at my desk with the lamp burning low, I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. The path was longer. It no longer ended at the farmhouse door. It stretched outward, pale brushstrokes unfurling across the field, creeping closer to the foreground of the canvas, as though painted freshly while I had looked away. And the figure, God help me, the figure was no longer pressed against the threshold. It had stepped forward. It was subtle at first, no more than a shift in posture, but I knew. Its feet, once swallowed by the shadows of the doorway, now rested firmly upon the pale path. The angle of its body had changed, its shoulders squared, its head tilted upward as though beginning its walk. My mouth went dry. I sat frozen, my eyes burning with the effort of not blinking. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of my lamp, and in that silence, I heard it the faintest creak, not from the painting but from the wooden floor beneath me, as though someone had matched my breath with their own. Someone had taken a careful step. I scrambled up, nearly knocking my chair over. My hands trembled, slick with sweat. I circled the apartment, whispering to myself that it was imagination, fatigue, anything. But when I returned to my desk, the painting awaited me, unflinching. The path stretched farther, and the figure stood closer to the frame. I couldn't eat that night. I couldn't think of anything else. Every few minutes I found myself staring, convinced it had moved again, that it was inching forward in those terrible, invisible increments. I tried to sleep on the couch, turning my back on it, but the sensation of presence filled the apartment like a draft that never settled. I would close my eyes, and behind my lids I saw it walking, slow, inevitable, each step erasing the distance between us. The nights that followed blurred together in a fevered rhythm of dread. Each evening, the figure drew closer to the edge of the canvas. Each evening, the sounds in the apartment grew louder, more distinct. At first, they were soft creaks, then deliberate footsteps, a slow dragging along the floorboards, circling me as I lay rigid in bed. I began locking my bedroom door, though I knew it was useless. Whatever this was, it was not bound by locks. Still, the ritual gave me the illusion of control, the faint hope that I had erected some barrier between myself and what waited beyond the canvas. But the painting never allowed me to forget. One night, as I lay wide-eyed in bed, I heard it, the knock. 3 times, low and hollow, from the living room where the farmhouse hung. My body seized with terror, and then silence. Minutes crawled by, my ears straining in the dark. Then came another sound, closer this time, just outside my bedroom door. The whisper of a breath, drawn long and slow, followed by the faintest scrape along the wood. I clutched the blanket to my chest, trembling, tears stinging my eyes. I wanted to scream, to call someone, anyone, but I could not move, could not risk drawing attention to myself. Eventually the sounds faded, or perhaps I simply passed out from fear. By morning the painting had changed again. The path now filled the entire foreground, stretching to the very bottom of the canvas. The farmhouse, once the dominant image, seemed smaller, receding in the distance, while the figure had grown nearer, larger, sharper. It stood at the very edge of the painted world, as if poised to step beyond the limits of its frame. And then it did. I can scarcely put words to that night. Even now, I wonder if I imagined it, if my mind finally snapped beneath the weight of sleeplessness and dread. But no, the memory is too vivid, too raw. It was past midnight. I sat in the living room, every lamp ablaze, my eyes fixed unblinking on the canvas. The air felt charged, alive, like the heavy silence before a storm. My skin prickled with static. The figure shifted, not in my mind, not as suggestion, but before my very eyes. Its head lifted, slowly, deliberately, until the hollow of its face seemed to meet mine. Then its foot moved one step forward, clear and undeniable. And in that instant, the brushstroke seemed to dissolve, the boundary of paint and canvas no longer holding it. The figure leaned, pressed against the inside of the frame, and the surface rippled like water. I gasped, stumbling back, my chair toppling behind me. The canvas bulged outward, the black of its shadow spilling beyond paint, bleeding into the light of my apartment. And then, dear God, it stepped out. One leg, long and thin, pale as wax, slid from the painting as though through liquid. Then the other. Its arms followed, stretching unnaturally, fingers too long, too narrow, curling against the floor. Finally, its head bowed no longer, emerged, and though its face was shrouded in darkness, I felt its gaze lock on me, a pressure against my skull so strong I thought my mind would split. I could not scream. I could not breathe. I stood rooted to the spot as the thing unfolded itself fully into my world, leaving the farmhouse behind. The canvas sagged back into place, now empty, a blank void where the figure had once been. The sound of its steps filled the apartment, slow, deliberate, echoing louder than they should have, as though the floor itself amplified them. It stood between me and the door, cutting off escape. The only movement I could manage was the violent trembling of my knees. It did not lunge. It did not rush. It only stood, its head tilted as though studying me, deciding. The silence between us was unbearable, a silence heavy with intent, with the knowledge that whatever it wanted, it had already begun. And then it took another step forward. I bolted for the bedroom, slamming the door, fumbling the lock with hands that shook so violently I could hardly twist it into place. My chest heaved, my heart pounding so loud I thought the walls would shake with it. I pressed my back against the door, tears streaming down my face, waiting for the inevitable crash, the sound of wood splintering, the end. But no sound came. Minutes passed. Hours, maybe. I lost track in my terror. Finally, when I dared to look, I saw it. The painting was no longer empty. The farmhouse remained, distant now, almost an afterthought. But in the foreground, in stark, clear detail, was me. I stood in the painted image, my own likeness captured in crude, cracked strokes, my face pale with fear, my eyes wide and hollow, and behind me, its shadow loomed, one hand extended, inches from my shoulder. I had thought the silence meant safety. I had thought the locked door, my desperate prayers, my trembling body pressed against the wood would keep the nightmare at bay. But silence can be crueler than sound. And in that silence I began to realize what had happened, that the painting had not lost me but claimed me. Morning came like a pale ghost, light bleeding weakly through my curtains, illuminating a room that felt no longer mine. I barely dared to move. My eyes dragged toward the painting as though drawn by invisible hands. And there it was, waiting, always waiting. My likeness stared back at me from within the frame. It wasn't just a vague smear of color anymore. It was me down to the fold of my shirt, the curve of my jaw, the same weary hollows beneath my eyes. I was painted in mid-motion, caught in that moment of turning away, as if the canvas had frozen me in an eternal retreat. Behind my painted self loomed the figure, its hand almost touching my shoulder. The sight hollowed me out. It was proof. Proof that the boundary had been broken, that the canvas wasn't a window but a trap, a record of everything it had taken. All day I kept my distance, pacing the apartment like a prisoner. I considered burning it, tearing it, throwing it out the window. I even dragged it down from the wall, trembling as my fingers gripped the frame. But the instant my skin touched the wood, I felt it heat, a subtle pulse, as though a living vein throbbed beneath. The smell of smoke stung my nostrils, though no fire burned. My vision swam, and in that blurred second, I saw movement on the canvas. The painted me turned its head. I dropped it with a cry, stumbling back, hitting the corner of the desk. The canvas clattered to the floor but did not tear, did not crack. When I looked again, the painted me was still but smiling faintly, a curve of lips I knew I had not made. That was when the knocks began again. Not from the painting this time, but from the walls. Slow, measured, patient. 3 knocks at the far corner of the room, then 3 more from the ceiling, then 3 from beneath the floorboards, as if the apartment itself had become a drum in its possession. I pressed my hands to my ears, rocking back and forth, whispering to myself that it wasn't real, couldn't be real. But the rhythm followed me from room to room, relentless. Night fell like a sentence. I sat awake in bed, eyes burning, every lamp blazing, every shadow a threat. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under, but it was no true sleep, only a gray drifting. In that haze, I felt the mattress dip, the air thicken, the cold weight of something settling beside me. When I snapped awake, my throat strangled with a half-formed scream. I was not alone. It stood at the foot of the bed, the figure, no longer confined by canvas, no longer half-formed shadow. It was here, fully, horribly here. Its limbs were too long, its head too low, its skin stretched thin like parchment pulled over bone. Its eyes, God, its eyes were holes, deep and black, drawing the room into them like gravity. I tried to move, but my body betrayed me. I could only tremble, breath tearing in shallow gasps, as it leaned forward, one step, then another, until it loomed over me. Not outside anymore, it whispered, though its mouth never moved. The words came from the air itself, a vibration in my bones. And then it reached. Its hand, pale and impossibly cold, brushed my chest. My body arched in agony, every nerve aflame, my vision fracturing into streaks of light. I felt it pulling, not flesh, not breath, but something deeper. My thoughts, my memories, my very self unraveled thread by thread, drawn from me like smoke into its hollow hand. I screamed, or thought I did. No sound left my throat. The room spun, dissolved. My body grew light, insubstantial. I was falling into the dark pit of its eyes. And when the spinning ceased, I was no longer in my room. I was in the painting. The farmhouse loomed in the distance. The path stretched before me, endless. I turned, slow and mechanical, and behind me it stood, always behind me, always waiting. The air smelled of rot and oil paint. The sky above was a permanent dusk, thick and unmoving. I tried to run, but my legs obeyed the will of the canvas, each step a repetition, each movement already known, already fixed. And somewhere, faintly, beyond the painted world, I heard it, the sound of my apartment door opening, footsteps echoing across the hardwood. Someone had come, another visitor, another collector, another fool drawn to a painting in a frame. I pounded against the invisible walls, screaming for them to leave, to destroy it, but no sound passed beyond the canvas. My voice died on the painted wind. The last thing I saw before the cycle closed was my own apartment now empty, lamps still burning, chair toppled where I had left it. The painting lay propped against the wall, its surface smooth, calm, betraying nothing, except, of course, for the figure of a man, me, forever trapped upon its path. And then the darkness folded shut. Weeks later, perhaps months' time means nothing here. I felt movement, a shift in the painted air, the farmhouse, the path, the sky, all as they ever were. But now another figure had appeared, faint at first, just a blur of form, walking toward me. Another has come to join the canvas, and I know, with a certainty sharper than any knife, that the painting will never be full. It will always hunger. It will always wait, because there is always someone willing to look too long. Story 7. The knocking at the window. I should start at the beginning, though even saying that feels like I'm trying to impose order on something that had no beginning, no middle, no clean ending, only an unfolding, like a long breath drawn in the dark. My name doesn't matter much, not anymore, and if you ever knew me outside this story, I think you'd understand why I prefer to leave it unsaid. What matters is the house, and the nights, and the sound that came with them. When Emma and I moved into the place, it felt like we were stepping into a postcard that had yellowed at the edges with time. It wasn't quite picturesque in the conventional sense, no white picket fences, no neat little flower beds, but there was something about the way the 2-story farmhouse stood at the edge of the tree line, the fields yawning open behind it, and the woods pressing close in front. It had that balance between wilderness and shelter that I'd secretly been craving after years of cramped apartments and the hum of traffic outside our windows. We told ourselves we were buying space, quiet, and time, a place where Emma could work on her writing without the constant noise of the city, and where I could finally sleep without hearing neighbors stomping on the ceiling. The realtor described it as rustic but with potential. That meant the paint was peeling, the floors creaked, and there were drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. But we didn't mind. In fact, we liked the flaws. They made the place feel honest, lived in, rather than scrubbed sterile like the high-rises we'd left behind. The first few days passed in the kind of blur that comes with any move. Cardboard boxes stacked high, dishes wrapped in yesterday's newsprint, the smell of fresh coffee percolating while we debated where the couch should go. I remember Emma standing at the kitchen sink one evening, her hands wrist-deep in suds, her hair tied back in a loose knot. The last of the day's sunlight fell through the wide window above the sink, scattering across her face like shards of gold. She looked peaceful, and I thought, yes, this is right. This is where we're supposed to be. It was on the third night that I first heard it. I had just gone to bed, still half buried in the unfamiliar quiet. No sirens in the distance, no drunken laughter spilling from a bar, no engine brakes screeching on asphalt, just silence. It was so thick I could hear my own pulse in my ears, the faint rush of blood in my temples. Emma was beside me, already drifting. And then, knock. A single deliberate rap against the window pane in our bedroom. I froze, mid-breath, my body tightening like a bowstring. The sound was so crisp, so intentional, that for a moment I thought it must be someone, an actual person standing right outside. But when I forced myself to sit up and glance toward the window, there was nothing but the pale reflection of our own room. The bed, the dresser, the faint silhouette of myself. The curtains were half drawn, letting in slats of moonlight that streaked across the floorboards. Beyond the glass, I saw only the dark outline of trees, swaying slightly in the night wind. I held still for a long time, listening, my ears strained. My heart thumped so loud I worried it might drown out anything else. Nothing. The next morning I didn't even mention it. I told myself it had been a branch, maybe, knocking against the siding. Houses make noises, especially old ones. The second time was harder to dismiss. It came 2 nights later. Same room, same hour, when the body is heaviest with sleep, and the mind least prepared for intrusion. This time it wasn't 1 knock, it was 3, spaced evenly apart. Knock, knock, knock. I woke instantly, as though the sound had reached straight through my dream and yanked me back. Emma stirred beside me, muttering something in her sleep, but didn't wake. I whispered her name. No response. Slowly I turned toward the window. The glass glinted faintly, pale with moonlight, and for a second I thought I saw the outline of something, someone, standing just beyond the pane. A trick of light, surely, because when I blinked, the shape dissolved, and the window reflected only emptiness again. I got up, padded across the room, and yanked the curtain shut with more force than necessary. My hands trembled slightly. The following morning I told Emma. She laughed at first, then frowned when she saw how serious I was. "It's an old house," she reminded me. "It settles. The wind picks up. You've always been a light sleeper." She wasn't wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd heard wasn't random. It had rhythm, intention. By the end of our first week in the house, the knocking had become almost nightly. Sometimes it came from the bedroom window, sometimes from the kitchen downstairs. Once this I remember with a particular kind of dread. It came from the narrow little window in the stairwell, the one that looked directly onto the gravel driveway. We tried explanations. Maybe kids were playing a prank, though we'd never seen anyone nearby. Maybe birds or raccoons, though the sound was too clean, too human. I even went outside one morning to check the siding, the window frames, the surrounding yard. No branches reached close enough. No footprints in the dirt. Nothing. But that didn't stop the knocks. They grew bolder, louder, sometimes a single rap, sometimes a series of 4 or 5, sharp and steady, and always, always, in the dead middle of the night. Emma pretended it didn't bother her at first. She'd roll over, pull the blankets tighter, mumble, "Ignore it. It's nothing." But I could tell it was getting under her skin. I'd catch her staring at the windows in daylight, her lips pressed tight, as though memorizing them, and me, I started dreading the dark in a way I hadn't since childhood. I'd linger downstairs with a book until my eyes burned, reluctant to climb to the bedroom. I left lamps on. I checked and rechecked locks. But none of it stopped the sound. What unsettled me most wasn't the knocking itself, but the space around it, the silence before and after, as though the night itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tell myself now that this was only the beginning, that the house was warning us, softly at first, before the warning turned into something else entirely. But of course we didn't understand then. We couldn't. We just kept listening to the windows. It didn't take long before the knocks began to arrange themselves into something that felt like language. At first, they were scattered single taps that could be dismissed as coincidence. But then they came in measured beats, a tempo slow and deliberate, too steady to be wind, too intentional to be dismissed. Knock, knock, knock. Always three. Always at intervals that seemed designed to draw the breath from my lungs and hold it there, suspended, while the night leaned in closer to listen. Emma and I grew restless. She was no longer laughing at my unease. She was living it herself. I'd wake in the small hours and find her already sitting upright, her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes fixed on the curtained window as though expecting it. She rarely spoke in those moments. If I asked whether she'd heard it again, she would just nod, tight-lipped, as if saying it aloud might give it more power. The air in the house grew different. I don't know how else to describe it. During the day it was almost normal, though even then the stillness felt heavier than it should. At night it thickened, like the house was exhaling something invisible into our lungs. It had a texture, that silence a weight against the skin. And when the knocking came, it wasn't a sound breaking the silence so much as the silence itself taking shape, sharpening into something you could measure, like a heartbeat. We tried to adjust. People can grow used to almost anything, even dread. We moved the bed away from the window. We left a radio on low, whispering static through the night. I even bought heavier curtains, thinking that maybe if we couldn't see the windows, we could pretend nothing stood beyond them. It didn't matter. The sound seeped through fabric and static alike. One evening, around midnight, I had dozed off in the armchair downstairs, a book splayed open on my chest. The house was dark except for a lamp by the couch. The quiet was so complete I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen. Then came the knock. This time not upstairs, not in the bedroom, but at the wide front window of the living room, less than 6 feet from where I Saturday. Knock, knock, knock. The book slid to the floor as I jerked upright. My eyes darted to the window. The lamp cast a cone of light that stopped just short of the glass, leaving the world beyond in murky shadow. For an instant, no longer than a blink, I thought I saw the suggestion of a figure standing just beyond that line of darkness. A tall, thin silhouette. I told myself it was reflection, imagination. I held myself still, listening, every nerve awake. But there was nothing more. No rustle of leaves, no footsteps retreating down the porch. When I finally forced myself to cross the room and yank the curtain shut, I felt certain, though I cannot prove it, that someone, or something, had been standing there, watching me watch them. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Emma found me at dawn, still sitting stiff in the chair, the curtain drawn tight. She didn't laugh. She didn't ask. She simply put a hand on my shoulder, and I could feel the tremor in her touch. From then on, the knocking came earlier, as though growing impatient. Sometimes just after midnight, sometimes before we had even gone to bed. Once, as we sat at dinner, forks halfway to our mouths, it rattled against the kitchen window with such precision that Emma dropped her glass. It shattered across the floor, and she didn't even flinch, just stared at the window, pale and still. We began keeping the lights on longer. Emma wanted to call someone, police, a neighbor, anyone, but who could we call? What would we even say? That the night was knocking at our windows. That silence had grown fingers to tap against the glass. And anyway, the nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away through the woods. The thought of walking that distance at night, with trees hemming close on both sides, filled me with a dread that sat deeper than the knocks themselves. It was during one of those restless evenings, just after the sun had set, that I saw it most clearly. I had gone to the sink to rinse a plate, water running hot over my fingers, steam rising against my face. The window above the sink looked out over the narrow strip of backyard that ended in the tree line. Usually, after dark, it reflected only the kitchen itself, lamp glow, my own tired features. But that night when I glanced up, I saw something else. A face. Not in detail, more the outline of one, pressed too close against the glass, nose almost touching, eyes like smudges of shadow. It was there, solid and unmistakable, and then it was gone, slipping back into the dark as though it had never been. The plate slipped from my hand, clattering into the sink. I stumbled back, breath tearing from my throat. Emma came running, demanding to know what had happened. I couldn't answer at first, only point with a trembling finger toward the window. She stared wide-eyed, but there was nothing now, only the reflection of the room, the faucet dripping steadily into the basin. We didn't sleep that night, or the next. The knocks came relentless, a rhythm etched into the marrow of the house. Knock, 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 and behind each strike I imagined the face I'd seen waiting, patient, pressed against the glass. I tried to tell myself that what I saw was only a trick of reflection, that my mind, deprived of rest and filled with tension, was conjuring faces out of steam and shadow the way children see monsters in the folds of curtains. Yet the certainty in my chest was heavier than doubt. It sat there like a stone, whispering that something had truly been there. Nose to glass, eyes watching, and it wasn't going to leave simply because I willed it into unreality. The days grew colder, the sun dipping earlier behind the trees, and though we tried to occupy ourselves with work and routine, every hour felt like waiting for nightfall, waiting for the knocks to resume. Emma stopped playing music in the evenings. She stopped humming absent-mindedly the way she used to. She stopped opening the blinds at all. The house grew dim and sealed, as though we were boarding ourselves up for a siege, and the forest outside seemed to know. When I looked through the windows during the day, there was no comfort in the view. The trees were too close, their bare branches interlocking to form a dark net of limbs, and I began to feel as though we were being held inside a rib cage of wood. The slightest breeze made them clatter like bones, and in those moments, I swore I saw gaps where the light bent wrong, places where a figure might have been standing between the trunks, watching. But night was worse. The knocks had grown bolder, moving from one side of the house to another, no longer confined to the bedroom window but pacing around us, mapping the walls with its measured rhythm, announcing itself like a slow procession circling prey. Sometimes it started at the kitchen, moved to the living room, then paused at the back door, each sequence punctuated by silence so deep it throbbed, silence that told me something was listening for our response. We tried ignoring it. We tried leaving every light burning until dawn, but the thing outside, whatever it was, didn't need darkness to knock. One afternoon, while Emma was chopping vegetables for dinner, 3 deliberate taps rattled against the patio door just behind her. She dropped the knife, spun around, and pressed her back to the counter, her face drained white. There was nothing there when I rushed over, only the wide expanse of glass reflecting our terror, but the sound had been clear, undeniable, the same cadence as always. That was the night Emma said the words we had both been circling but too afraid to speak. It's not a person, and I didn't argue, because she was right. If it had been some stalker, some cruel neighbor playing games, we would have heard footsteps retreating, would have seen evidence left behind. Instead, there was only the sound itself, and the suggestion of presence that vanished like breath against a mirror the moment we tried to catch it. The house began to resist us. I don't mean in any visible way. It was still the same walls, same doors, but the air felt charged. Every surface seemed to hum faintly in anticipation, like static waiting for a spark. We argued more, not because of each other, but because the fear needed somewhere to go. Emma accused me of not taking it seriously enough. I accused her of feeding it by acknowledging it aloud. But the truth was that neither of us could escape it, no matter how hard we tried to pretend. Then came the night I saw it clearly, not just a hint or a smear of face, but the whole outline, unmistakable and wrong. It was late, after 2 in the morning. I had crept downstairs for water, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight, though I tried to move silently, because somehow silence felt safer, as if sound itself might summon it closer. I stood in the kitchen with the glass half raised when I heard the knock, 3 sharp strikes, right there at the patio door again, so close it seemed to vibrate through my bones. I froze, staring at the glass, and there it was, a tall figure standing just beyond, not lit by the porch light but still visible, a density of shadow darker than the night around it, elongated limbs barely human in proportion, head tilted slightly as if studying me. It didn't move, not even when I stumbled back and dropped the glass, water splashing cold against my feet. It only stood there, patient, waiting. Then, just as my breath began to break into panicked gasps, it leaned forward, so close its shape blurred against the glass, and tapped again 3 times, slower than before, deliberate enough that each one seemed to echo in my chest. I don't remember climbing the stairs. I only remember Emma shaking me awake hours later, asking why I had slept in the hallway, and the shame of realizing I had abandoned the downstairs entirely, leaving lights blazing and the door still uncurtained. After that, I avoided looking out of any window after dark. I drew the curtains before sunset and kept my eyes firmly away from the thin cracks between fabric. But it didn't matter, because the knocking no longer needed my gaze to find me. Sometimes it came from the walls themselves, a hollow rapping, like knuckles striking plaster. Sometimes it came from the attic above our heads, 3 taps spreading through the beams until it felt as if the house itself had learned the rhythm. And once, though I still cannot bring myself to believe it, I felt it from inside the bedroom closet, 3 muted knocks against the thin wooden door as I lay frozen in bed, Emma clutching my arm so tightly, her nails broke the skin. We told no one. Who could we tell? There was no evidence, nothing but sound and glimpses that slipped away before anyone else could see. And deep down, I think both of us understood that speaking of it to the outside world would not protect us, it would only mark us further, bind us more tightly to whatever had chosen our windows as its stage. The days blurred into nights, the nights into a single unbroken knock stretched across time. I lost track of meals, of sleep, of anything except the rhythm that had carved itself into our lives. Knock, knock, knock. It had become a heartbeat, not our own. And we could feel it getting closer. I used to believe that walls meant safety, that doors and locks and solid beams were barriers between myself and the world. But what comfort can wood or plaster provide when the thing that hunts you does not need a key, when it does not even knock on glass anymore but finds its way inside the spaces of the house itself, until the air you breathe tastes of it, until your skin prickles with its proximity though there is no one in sight. It started subtly, in ways I almost convinced myself were coincidences. A draft that whispered across my face even with every window sealed tight. A creak in the hallway that traveled against the grain of my own footsteps. The faint smell of earth, wet, loamy, forest soil clinging to the kitchen in the middle of the night as though someone had tracked mud across the floor and then erased the prints before dawn. Emma noticed too, though she tried to bury it. She tried to tell herself we were only primed for fear, but I could see it in the way she hesitated before opening closets, the way she listened too long to silence, as if it might speak. The knocking changed. It was no longer confined to 3 taps at glass. It crawled into the bones of the house, low, resonant thuds that made the pictures tremble against the walls, soft skittering scratches in the ducts overhead, an occasional slow, deliberate thump beneath the floorboards where no basement existed. And one night, when Emma pressed her ear to the bedroom wall, she flinched back so violently I thought she had been struck. She told me, her lips pale, her eyes refusing to focus, that she had heard it breathing. I didn't want to believe her, but I did because I had felt it too. The walls seemed to pulse faintly when I leaned against them, not the steady vibration of pipes or settling wood, but a rhythm, irregular, almost human, as if the plaster itself had lungs straining to inhale. Sometimes late at night I swore I could hear a faint whisper threaded within the sound, a murmur that had no language yet somehow carried intent, a cadence that suggested invitation and threat all at once. The house grew hostile. Lights flickered not in random bursts but in patterns, aligning with the knocks, stuttering in sequences that felt deliberate. The digital clock by my bed blinked 3:33 every time I woke in terror, no matter when I fell asleep, as though the hours themselves had been bent to the shape of this thing. Shadows did not remain where shadows should. They crawled, stretched, reached, sometimes freezing into the vague outline of a figure standing where no figure belonged. Emma begged to leave, but where could we go? The knocks had followed us once already when we tried to spend a night at her sister's apartment across town. At exactly the same hour, 3 deliberate taps rattled the glass balcony door, and though her sister slept through it, Emma and I heard it clearly, felt it vibrating in our bones, and we knew then with sick certainty that it was not tied to the house but to us. I began to dread my own reflection. Not because of what I saw in the mirror, though my face was gaunt, sleepless, hollow-eyed, but because of what lingered behind me, half-formed, a darker outline just outside the corner of sight. Sometimes, in the fogged bathroom mirror after a shower, There were fingerprints trailing down the condensation, too high, too wide to be mine or Emma's. The escalation was not fast, not a sudden break, but a tightening coil. Every night the thing pressed closer, every knock more insistent, every whisper more invasive, until reality itself began to thin. The line between dream and waking blurred. I would bolt upright in bed, certain that someone had entered the room, my heart a hammer in my chest, and the darkness would feel swollen, occupied, thick with presence. Emma would whisper that she had seen it standing by the dresser, long arms brushing the floor, but when I lit the lamp, there was nothing but overturned dust motes. Then came the night the walls themselves betrayed us. The knocks began in their usual cadence, circling the house, steady, patient, inevitable. We sat in bed, clutching each other, waiting for it to pass, though it never did, and as the rhythm grew louder, the plaster beside the window began to bulge outward, just slightly at first, like breath against fabric, then deeper, swelling as if something behind it was pushing to get through. Cracks formed, hairline fractures racing like veins across the paint, and from within them seeped that smell of wet soil, pungent, suffocating, the scent of graves disturbed. Emma screamed when the bulge pulsed, as though it had a heartbeat, and I could not move. I could only watch as the outline of a hand pressed against the wall from the other side, 5 long fingers stretching, testing the boundary, leaving behind an indentation that remained even after the pressure withdrew. The knocking that followed shook the entire frame of the house, not outside, not glass, but from within the walls themselves, each blow a demand, each blow a promise. We did not sleep that night, nor the next, because sleep had become an invitation, a surrender, and I was terrified that if I closed my eyes, I would awaken to find the thing not knocking but standing beside the bed, patient, waiting, no longer needing the courtesy of walls to separate us. Emma asked me one question quietly, with tears streaking her face, and it was the question I had been avoiding all along. What if it's not trying to come in? What if it's trying to let us out? Her words burrowed into me, because once she spoke them, I realized I had felt it too, the strange pull, the sensation that the house had become less a shelter and more a cage, and that what pressed against the walls was not invading but peeling back the boundaries, opening a way. And the thought of stepping through filled me with as much terror as comfort, because what waited beyond was not the world we knew. And the knocks, they were no longer a question. They were an answer. I used to think the night was something you could wait out, that if you clenched your teeth, locked the doors, and forced your eyes open until morning light, you could survive whatever haunted hours pressed in. But dawn did not come for us, not in any way that mattered, because the knocking did not belong to the cycle of night and day, it belonged to us, and it had learned our names. It began as always, 3 deliberate raps that resonated through the house like iron striking bone. But this time they did not fade or circle. They multiplied, echoing from every direction at once: glass, walls, floorboards, even the hollow space inside my own skull, until Emma and I clutched our heads, crying out, begging for it to stop. And when the sound ceased, the silence was worse, because silence meant it was already here. The air grew dense, almost liquid, each breath an effort, and with every inhale came the reek of damp soil and rotted leaves, stronger than ever before, as though we had been buried alive. The walls, once merely trembling, now buckled inward, the paint blistering, plaster slouging off in sheets, revealing a darkness beneath that was not wood or brick but something vast, something endless. Out of that darkness, the outline took shape, not confined to glass or reflection, not an echo of shadow, but flesh made wrong, limbs too long, joints bending with grotesque patience, a head cocked at an impossible angle as though listening to our very hearts beating in terror. Emma screamed, but her voice was swallowed before it left her throat, as if the house itself devoured sound. She stumbled back, clutching at me, eyes wide and wild, mouthing words I could not hear. Don't look, don't look, don't look. But I did. I couldn't stop myself. And when I met its gaze, if those hollows could be called eyes, I felt something inside me split, a seam of self tearing open, memory and thought unraveling into threads that the thing pulled taut, weaving them into its silence. The knocking resumed, softer now, slower, from within my chest, three dull thuds that matched the stuttering of my heart. Emma's eyes filled with horror as she backed away from me. Not from it, but from me, whispering words I could finally hear. "It chose you." I tried to tell her she was wrong, that we were still in this together, but the words would not leave my mouth. My tongue was heavy, my jaw locked, and when I reached for her, my hand did not obey. It rose too slowly, fingers unfurling in a rhythm that was not mine, a mirror of the hand that still pressed against the wall, black and stretching, pulling reality thin. The last thing I remember of Emma was her running toward the door, fumbling with the lock, her sobs breaking through the air like glass, and the thing letting her go, because it did not want her. It wanted me. The house collapsed without noise, the walls folding inward like paper consumed by flame. Yet I remained standing in a hollow that was not emptiness but eternity, surrounded by 1,000 windows that looked not out upon the world but into it, into every place I had ever been, every moment I had ever tried to forget. And at each window something knocked 3 times, always 3, and I knew, with a clarity that stripped me bare, that I had become the echo. So if you are listening to this now, if some late-night frequency has carried my voice into your room, do not look toward the glass. Do not press your ear to the wall. And above all, do not answer the knock, because it is not asking to come in. It is asking to let me out. And so, the night closes on our tales. You've walked with the night watcher in the forest. You've felt the visitor who texts from inside your home. You've ridden the elevator down to a floor that should not exist. You've stared too long at a painting that stared back. And you've heard the knocking that was never meant to end. If you've made it this far, you already know. The stories don't stay trapped here. They linger. They follow. They wait. When you turn off this screen, the silence around you might not be silence at all. So listen closely, before sleep takes you. What was that sound at your window? This is Little Dream, wishing you a restless good night. Until the next story finds you. Fade with faint static, maybe a heartbeat or a single knock before silence.